There is a photograph that no longer exists in any public archive anywhere in the world. It was taken in Australia in 1898, in a region of Queensland that was already known among the people who lived there for stories that the colonial administration preferred not to discuss. The photograph showed a man, or something shaped like a man. The accounts that survive the photograph itself describe a figure of extraordinary height, standing beside European researchers whose presence in the frame provided an unmistakable sense of scale. The figure was not a trick of angle or perspective. The figure was not a costume or a construction. The figure was a living human being of dimensions that the official science of 1898 classified as impossible, and which the official science of every year since has continued to insist could not have existed. Within weeks of the photograph being developed and circulated among the small group of researchers who had commissioned the expedition, representatives of the colonial government arrived at the expedition's base. The photographs were taken, the field notes were taken, the physical measurements that had been recorded were taken. Two of the three researchers who had been present at the moment the photograph was captured declined in subsequent years to speak about what they had seen. The third researcher, a man whose name appears in the documentary record only in fragments and partial references, reportedly spent the last years of his life attempting to reconstruct from memory what the photograph had shown and what the figure standing in it had said to the interpreters who accompanied the expedition. He never succeeded in convincing anyone with institutional authority to take his account seriously. He died in 1931. His private papers were not preserved. This is not a story that begins in 1898. It begins much earlier, in the deep time of a continent whose human history extends so far back that the civilization we call colonial Australia represents only the most recent layer of an occupation that goes back 60,000 years or more. And within that deep history, running like a thread through the oral traditions of dozens of Aboriginal nations across the length and breadth of the continent, is a consistent account of beings who were like the people who told the stories, but larger, much larger. Larger in ways that the people who preserved these accounts across countless generations clearly regarded as significant, as worthy of preservation, as something that had happened and therefore needed to be remembered. What follows is a careful examination of the evidence, the accounts, the suppressions, and the silences. It is presented not as definitive proof of anything, but as a record of what was seen, what was documented, what was then taken away, and why the taking away may tell us as much as the photographs themselves would have. If you're settling in for this journey, we are glad you're here. Subscribe before we go further, because the deeper this story goes, the more it becomes clear that the people who would prefer it not be told are still, in various ways, ensuring that it remains difficult to find. Stay with us. We're going to take this slowly. The first thing on our list is the photograph itself, and the expedition that produced it, and the strange and specific silence that followed its seizure. The second is the year 1898, and what was happening in Australia in that year that made the existence of such a photograph particularly inconvenient for particular people. The third is the long record of European encounters with Australians of extraordinary size that predates the photograph by over a century. And from there we will move deeper into the Aboriginal traditions, into the colonial archives, into the newspaper rooms and the museum basements, and the locked files that have never fully been opened. Take a breath, let the room settle around you. This is a long story, and it has been waiting a long time to be told. The first item on our list is the photograph that disappeared, and everything we can reconstruct about what it showed. The expedition of 1898 was not a major undertaking by the standards of the era. It was a small party, funded privately rather than through any government institution, organised by men whose interest in the interior of Queensland was connected to a set of reports that had been circulating quietly among researchers and naturalists for several years prior. Those reports described encounters, some recent and some historical, with Aboriginal individuals of exceptional physical stature. The word exceptional here is doing a great deal of work. Tall people exist everywhere. People of remarkable height can be found in any population. What the reports described was something categorically different from remarkable height. They described men and women whose proportions, whose overall physical scale exceeded anything that the researchers reading the reports had personally encountered, and whose existence in the oral tradition of the Aboriginal communities of the region was treated not as anomalous, but as a known and continuous fact about the human landscape of the interior. The expedition travelled for approximately 6 weeks before making contact with the community, whose accounts had formed the basis of the earlier reports. The details of that contact, the names of the intermediaries, the specific location in Queensland, the identity of the Aboriginal nation involved, all of these details were in the field notes that were seized in the weeks following the expedition's return. What survived were the accounts of the researchers themselves, given privately over the following years to people they trusted and occasionally committed to letters that were not destroyed along with the official documentation. From those accounts, a picture emerges of a community that was not hiding. The individual who was photographed was not reluctant. He stood for the photograph willingly, in the manner of a person who understood what was being recorded and had no particular objection to being recorded. He was described in the surviving accounts as elderly. His hair was white. He moved carefully, in the way that very old people move when the weight of the body has become a consideration in itself. And he was, by the consistent account of everyone present, of a height that none of the European researchers in the party had any framework for processing. The estimates varied. The accounts do not entirely agree on the specific measurement, which is not surprising given that no one in the party had anticipated needing to measure a living person, and the instruments available were those brought for geological and botanical survey work. The range given across the surviving accounts falls between 8.5 and 9.5 feet. One account suggests the researchers attempted to create a measurement reference by having the tallest member of the European party stand beside the figure, and that this European researcher, who was described separately as a large man of over 6 feet, reached approximately to the figure's chest. The photograph captured this. That is what the photograph showed. A very old man of impossible height, standing in the landscape of the Queensland interior, beside a group of European researchers whose ordinary human scale made the contrast undeniable and unambiguous. That photograph no longer exists in any accessible archive. The second item on our list concerns the year 1898 itself, and the specific circumstances of colonial Australia that made the seizure of this photograph not merely possible, but, from the perspective of certain institutional interests, necessary. Australia in 1898 was in the final years before Federation. The 6 colonies that would become the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901 were in the process of negotiating that transition, and the politics of that negotiation were deeply entangled with questions of identity, with questions of what Australia was and what it was going to be, and with the specific and uncomfortable question of the Aboriginal populations who had been present on the continent for 60,000 years before the arrival of European settlers. The colonial governments of the late 19th century had developed a coherent, if morally catastrophic, framework for thinking about the Aboriginal people of Australia. This framework held that the Aboriginal populations were the remnants of a primitive and dying civilization, that their cultural practices were without scientific interest, that their oral traditions were the superstitions of a people who had no access to rational thought, and that the appropriate response of an advancing civilization was to absorb, assimilate, or simply allow to disappear whatever was left of these populations. This framework was not privately held. It was published in scientific journals. It was taught in universities. It formed the explicit basis of government policy. Within this framework, the existence of a community containing an elderly man of 9 feet in height was not merely a scientific curiosity. It was a direct challenge to the foundational assumptions on which the framework rested. If the Aboriginal people of the Queensland interior included individuals of extraordinary physical dimensions that had no parallel in the European populations that were supposedly replacing them, then the picture of primitive dying peoples being superseded by advanced, vigorous civilization became considerably more complicated. If those individuals were known within the Aboriginal community, were regarded within that community's own traditions as connected to a deep and continuous human history on the continent, then the tradition itself was revealed as containing information of genuine significance, which the colonial framework had written off as superstition. The photograph, had it been published and widely circulated, would have raised questions that the colonial administration of 1898 was structurally incapable of answering. So, the photograph was not published and widely circulated. The specific mechanism of the seizure has never been formally documented. There is no government memorandum that has surfaced in the colonial archives saying that agents were dispatched to recover photographs of Aboriginal giants. What the record shows, in the fragmentary way that suppressed records always show things, is the absence of material that should be there. The expedition's formal report was never submitted. The researchers' institutional affiliations, which would normally have produced records of their activities, contain gaps for the period in question. The photographic plates, which would have been developed at a specific facility in Brisbane, and which would normally have produced a record of their development and any copies made, appear not to have reached that facility. Or if they reached it, the record of their arrival was removed. This is what institutional suppression looks like in the historical record. Not a dramatic theft, not men in uniform bursting through doors. A series of quiet absences in documentation that would not be noticed unless someone went looking for specific things and found specific holes where those things should have been. Someone went looking, eventually. That someone was a researcher in the 1970s whose interest in colonial Queensland history had been piqued by a reference in a private letter collection held by a historical society in New South Wales. The reference was to the expedition of 1898, made in passing in a letter written by a man who had heard about the photograph from one of the researchers involved. The 1970s researchers spent 4 years following the documentary trail and published a paper in a small journal in 1979 that has since become extremely difficult to find in any library system. The third item on our list is the long record of European encounters with unusually large Aboriginal Australians, a record that extends back to the earliest years of European settlement, and that constitutes, taken as a whole, an amount of testimony that is difficult to dismiss as fantasy or confusion. The first fleet arrived at Botany Bay in January of 1788. The accounts written by officers and officials of that fleet in the weeks and months following the landing describe a population of Aboriginal people who were, in many cases, physically impressive to European eyes accustomed to the relatively modest average stature of working-class Britons of the 18th century. This in itself is not remarkable. The Aboriginal Australians of the coastal regions were, by the standards of the era, healthy and well-nourished, and their physical development reflected this. But scattered among the general accounts of the coastal Aboriginal population are specific references to individuals of exceptional size, references made in a tone of genuine surprise that distinguishes them from the more routine observations about the general health and stature of the population. Arthur Phillip, the first governor of New South Wales, wrote in his dispatches of encounters with Aboriginal men who struck him as distinctly larger than others in their communities, men whose height and physical presence he found noteworthy enough to record specifically. These references are brief and not elaborated upon, which is consistent with the way that anomalous observations tend to appear in official correspondence. Noted but not developed, because developing them would require the writer to advance claims that they knew would be received skeptically. The account of John Hunter, who served as a naval officer during the First Fleet and later as governor of New South Wales, is more specific. Hunter's private journals, as opposed to his official correspondence, contain a description of an encounter in the inland regions of New South Wales, in which he describes a group of Aboriginal men, one of whom was of such extraordinary height that Hunter estimated him at approaching 7 feet, adding that this figure moved and carried himself in a manner that suggested this height was not the product of any abnormality, but was simply the natural scale of the man. 7 feet is not 9 feet, but Hunter's account comes from the early years of the settlement, from coastal and near coastal regions, and it is worth noting that the accounts from the interior, from deeper into the continent, consistently describe larger figures than those encountered on the coast. This pattern, of larger figures reported further into the interior, appears consistently across the 19th century. The explorers who pushed into the Australian interior during the great expeditions of the 19th century, the expeditions of Oxley and Sturt and Mitchell and Leichhardt and the others, produced accounts that are officially focused on geography and natural history, but that contain, in the margins and in the private journals that were not intended for publication, observations about the Aboriginal populations of the interior that include specific references to individuals of exceptional size. Thomas Mitchell, whose expeditions into the interior of the continent in the 1830s produced some of the most detailed early documentation of the regions that would later become Victoria and Queensland, kept private journals alongside his official survey records. Those private journals, portions of which are held in the Mitchell Library in Sydney, contain several references to encounters with Aboriginal men whom Mitchell estimated at heights well above 6 feet, and at least one reference to a figure whose dimensions Mitchell describes with a level of uncertainty that suggests he did not fully trust his own perception of what he was seeing. The Mitchell Library reference is worth pausing on, because the Mitchell Library is itself a site of particular interest in this story. It holds an enormous collection of historical documentation relating to the exploration and settlement of Australia, including material donated by exploration parties and private individuals over the course of more than a century. It also holds, in its uncatalogued and restricted collections, material that has never been fully inventoried or made publicly accessible. Researchers who have attempted to work with certain portions of the Mitchell Library's holdings have reported over the years encountering gaps and restrictions that do not have obvious explanations in terms of preservation concerns or privacy protections. What those gaps contain is, by definition, unknown, but the pattern of their location, when it can be mapped, aligns with some consistency to the periods and regions that produce the most persistent accounts of unusually large Aboriginal Australians. The fourth item on our list is the Aboriginal Dreamtime tradition itself, and the specific accounts within that tradition that describe beings of extraordinary size as a consistent and remembered feature of the human landscape of the continent. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to approach the Dreamtime tradition as a collection of myths in the dismissive sense that the word myth is sometimes used as a synonym for stories that are not true. The Dreamtime tradition is not mythology in that sense. It is a comprehensive system for recording and transmitting knowledge across generations, a system that is proven, in case after documented case, to contain accurate information about geological events, astronomical phenomena, and ecological conditions that mainstream science has only recently been able to verify through other means. The Aboriginal traditions that describe the flooding of coastal areas contain accurate information about sea level changes that occurred thousands of years ago. The traditions that describe geological events match the physical record of those events with a precision that cannot be explained by guesswork. When the Dreamtime tradition says something happened, the appropriate response is not dismissal but inquiry. The Dreamtime traditions of multiple Aboriginal nations across the continent describe beings they call by various names in various languages, beings that are described with a remarkable consistency as human in form, but significantly larger than ordinary humans. These beings appear in traditions from the Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, from the Kimberley region of Western Australia, from the desert regions of South Australia, from the coastal areas of Victoria and New South Wales, and from the tropical north. The geographic spread of these accounts is not the spread of a single invented tradition. It is the spread of a shared memory. The Yowie is the most widely known name for these beings in the popular culture of Australia, and the popular culture treatment of the Yowie has done significant damage to serious inquiry into these accounts, because the popular culture treatment has situated the Yowie firmly in the category of entertaining folklore, placing it alongside Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster as one of the pleasant amusements of the credulous. This categorization is convenient for those who would prefer the underlying accounts not be examined carefully. The Yowie accounts, stripped of the popular culture accretion, are not entertainment. They are consistent reports, across nations that had no historical contact with each other, sufficient to explain the consistency of beings that share specific physical characteristics, and that appear in the traditions in specific types of locations and in specific relationships to the communities that preserved the accounts. The Bundjalung people of northern New South Wales and southern Queensland have traditions describing beings they call Quinkin that are specifically human in form, that are described as very tall, and that are associated with specific geographic locations that the Bundjalung continue to avoid, or to approach only in specific ritual contexts, long after European settlement disrupted most of their traditional practices. The Quinkin traditions were recorded by researchers in the mid-20th century and are preserved in partial form in the academic literature on Aboriginal oral tradition. What the academic literature tends not to emphasize is the physical specificity of the descriptions, the attention to height and proportion, and the way these beings moved and the sounds they made. The physical specificity suggests eyewitness accounts filtered through oral tradition, not invented mythology. The Wiradjuri people of central New South Wales have traditions that describe beings of great size as having inhabited the river systems of the interior in the time before the current era. The Wiradjuri traditions are specific about location, associating these large beings with particular stretches of particular rivers, and specific about behavior, describing the beings as generally solitary, as preferring the deeper and more remote stretches of river country, and as having been regarded by the human communities that shared the landscape with them with a mixture of respect and caution. The respect and caution in these accounts is not the response to supernatural entities. It is the response to large, physically powerful beings that were encountered in the real landscape and that pose real and specific types of risk to human communities of ordinary size. The Kamilaroi people, whose traditional country covers much of northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, have traditions that describe large beings associated specifically with areas of deep cave systems and with elevated rocky terrain. The Kamilaroi accounts are among the most detailed in terms of physical description, and they include references to what sounds, in translation, like a description of beings in the later stages of their existence. Beings who were becoming less numerous, who were retreating to more remote terrain, who were in some sense aware of their own diminishment. This element, of a population in decline and in retreat, appears in the large being traditions of several different Aboriginal nations, and is consistent across those traditions in its tone of something being remembered that is past rather than something currently present. This is significant. The traditions do not generally describe these beings as present in the current era. They describe them as historical, as having been part of the landscape in a time that is clearly positioned as prior to the present, but not so remote as to be mythological in the sense of a time before human memory. They are described as something that the communities telling the stories remember having known about, or having known about from their parents and grandparents, not as something from the dawn of creation. This temporal placement of the accounts, in a period that feels like recent but not current history, is consistent with a population that was genuinely declining and eventually absent by the time of European settlement, but that was present and known to the communities that became the repositories of the tradition. The question of when these beings were last present in the Aboriginal traditions is connected by several threads of evidence to the period of earliest European contact. And the period of earliest European contact is, as we have already noted, the period in which specific and credible European accounts of unusually large Aboriginal individuals begin to appear. These two streams of evidence, the oral tradition of a population in recent decline and the European eyewitness accounts of specific individuals of exceptional size, point toward each other across 2 centuries of official silence. The 5th item on our list is the Murray River discoveries, and the bones that were found in the burial mounds along that river system in the late 19th century, and the questions about where those bones went. The Murray River is the longest river in Australia. It forms the boundary between New South Wales and Victoria, and drains a vast basin that includes some of the most productive agricultural land on the continent. The river system was intensively inhabited by Aboriginal communities for tens of thousands of years, and the evidence of that habitation is present across the landscape in the form of burial mounds, middens, and archaeological deposits that extend over hundreds of kilometres of river frontage. The European settlers who established farms and stations along the Murray in the 19th century encountered these burial mounds as a routine feature of the landscape, and the practice of disturbing these mounds, either for agricultural purposes or for the curiosity of the settlers, was common and largely unremarked. What was sometimes found inside those mounds, and what was occasionally documented before being further disturbed or lost, is the subject of this section. The accounts are scattered through local histories, through the private correspondence of settlers and station managers, through the records of early colonial naturalists and surveyors, and occasionally through the archives of institutions like the Australian Museum and various state museums that received donations of objects and remains from people who had found them along the river. They are not concentrated in a single place, and no researcher has produced a comprehensive survey of them, which is itself part of the problem. What the accounts describe, with enough consistency to demand attention, is the presence in some of the Murray River burial mounds of skeletal remains that were significantly larger than the remains of the general Aboriginal population of the region. The descriptions range from impressionistic tall bones in old accounts that use the word tall without any specific measurement to more precise, accounts that include estimates of the length of specific bones, particularly femurs and tibias, that the recorder has compared to the dimensions of ordinary adult human remains and found substantially larger. The most specific account in the documentary record comes from a station manager in the Riverina district whose property bordered the Murray and who encountered a burial mound during a flood in 1882 that the flood waters had partially exposed and partially eroded. The station manager wrote to the Colonial Geological Survey of New South Wales, describing what he had found in some detail, including estimates of skeletal dimensions that implied a total height for the individual of approximately 7.5 to 8 feet. He inquired about the appropriate procedure for reporting such a find and for preserving the remains for scientific study. He received a reply from the survey instructing him to cover the remains and mark the location, and that a representative would be dispatched to examine them. No representative appears to have been dispatched. The station manager's follow-up letter, written several months later, asking whether anyone would be coming and reporting that local flooding had further disturbed the site, received no reply that has survived in the survey's records. The site itself was subsequently built over. The bones, if they survived the flooding and the construction, are buried under infrastructure that no current government body has any interest in disturbing to answer questions that official science does not regard as legitimate. This is the fifth pattern in the list of patterns that emerges from examining this material. The report, the promise of official attention, the failure of official attention to materialize, and the subsequent loss of the physical evidence. The pattern repeats across the Murray River accounts with a regularity that, once noticed, is impossible to unsee. There are at least 6 documented instances in the period between 1870 and 1910 in which skeletal remains of unusual dimensions were reported along the Murray River system, in which official institutions were notified, in which some form of official response was promised, and in which the physical evidence subsequently became unavailable. In some cases, the unavailability is explicable by ordinary circumstances: flooding, agricultural disturbance, the general indifference of the era to the preservation of Aboriginal cultural material. But the consistency of the pattern, 6 instances with the same structure of report and disappearance, exceeds what ordinary circumstance comfortably explains. The 6th item on our list concerns the Queensland expeditions more broadly, the series of research parties that travelled into the interior of Queensland in the period between 1870 and 1910, and the specific pattern of what their records contain and what their records omit. Queensland was the frontier in this period. It was the part of Australia furthest from the centres of colonial power, the part where the distance between official narrative and physical reality was greatest, and the part where the Aboriginal populations had been subjected to some of the most violent aspects of colonial dispossession, while simultaneously retaining access to territory and traditional knowledge that had been lost further south and east. The interior of Queensland was, in practical terms, only partly explored by European researchers until well into the 19th century, and the communities living in that interior had not yet been fully disrupted by the processes of settlement that had already transformed the more accessible parts of the continent. This meant that Queensland in the 1870s and 1880s was a place where the things that had been erased or marginalised elsewhere could still, in the more remote regions, be encountered. The researchers who travelled there, many of them operating under the auspices of institutions like the Queensland Museum, the Queensland Geographical Society, and various private natural history organisations, brought back collections of specimens, botanical and zoological and geological, that formed the basis of the colony's early scientific institutions. They also brought back accounts in their private journals and correspondence of human encounters that their official reports did not contain. The Queensland Museum's early holdings included, according to an inventory produced in the 1890s, skeletal material from Aboriginal burial sites across the interior of the colony. That inventory listed dimensions for various items in the collection. Some entries in the inventory describe bone lengths that, if the inventory measurements are accurate, imply individuals of heights well above what the official anthropology of the period considered the maximum for the Aboriginal population of the region. The inventory itself is accessible in the Queensland State Archives. The skeletal material it describes is not. The museum's records from the late 19th and early 20th century are incomplete, and the discrepancy between what the inventory lists and what the current institution holds has not been formally addressed. The museum has, when asked about the discrepancy by researchers, attributed it to the losses and disorganization typical of colonial-era institutions that were established without adequate resources for long-term preservation. This is a plausible explanation. It is also an explanation that is identical in structure to the explanations offered for every other instance in this list, where physical evidence of large Aboriginal individuals was reported and then became unavailable. At some point, the consistency of the explanation raises questions about the explanation itself. The seventh item on our list is the specific role of government in the suppression of evidence, and what can be reconstructed about the mechanisms by which that suppression operated. We've already touched on the 1898 photograph and its seizure, and on the failure of official response to the Murray River reports. But the government's engagement with this material was not limited to reactive seizure and neglect. There is evidence in the documentary record of a more systematic approach to ensuring that certain types of evidence did not enter the public domain. The evidence for this systematic approach comes primarily from the archives of institutions that were themselves participants in the suppression, and therefore held records that the suppressors did not think to destroy, because the records describe normal institutional activity from the perspective of the people conducting it. The naturalizing of suppression, the treatment of the removal of inconvenient evidence as a routine administrative function, is one of the defining characteristics of institutional suppression at its most effective, and it is one of the reasons that the record of what was suppressed is sometimes more accessible than you might expect, because it was recorded by people who did not think they were doing anything that needed to be hidden. The colonial governments of Australia in the late 19th century maintained what they called protection boards, official bodies nominally dedicated to the welfare of Aboriginal communities, but actually functioning as mechanisms of control, surveillance, and information management. The protection boards had the authority to restrict access to Aboriginal communities, to control the movements of Aboriginal individuals, to manage the disposal of Aboriginal cultural property, and to determine what information about Aboriginal communities reached the public domain. Their records are extensive, held across multiple state archives, and they contain, if you know what you're looking for, evidence of their engagement with the material we have been examining. The New South Wales Protection Board records from the 1890s and 1900s contain a series of communications about what the board's documents call unusual individuals in Aboriginal communities of the Western District. The communications are between field officers and the central office in Sydney. They describe reports from settlers and station managers about Aboriginal individuals of exceptional size. They discuss whether these individuals should be brought to Sydney for examination by scientific institutions. They record decisions about how to handle the reports. What the decisions consistently amount to is a determination that the reports should not be further investigated through public or institutional channels, and that the individuals concerned should not be subject to the kind of examination that would produce permanent scientific records. The reasons given for these decisions, in the communications that record them, are framed in the language of welfare and protection. The individuals concerned are described as elderly, as residing in remote communities, as likely to find the disruption of examination distressing. This framing of suppression as protection is a familiar mechanism in the history of colonial administration, and it is worth noting that it achieved, whatever its actual motivation, the same result as active suppression, the creation of a documentary record that acknowledged the existence of the individuals in question, while ensuring that no permanent scientific documentation of them was produced. The eighth item on our list is the newspaper record, and the remarkable number of articles published in Australian newspapers between 1870 and 1910 that describe encounters with Aboriginal individuals of extraordinary size, or that report the discovery of large skeletal remains. The Australian newspaper archive from this period is substantial. The digitisation of historical Australian newspapers through Trove, the National Library of Australia's digital repository, has made it possible to search this archive in ways that were not previously available to researchers. And a search of the Trove archive using relevant search terms reveals a pattern of reporting on large Aboriginal individuals and large skeletal remains that is far more extensive than the academic literature on this subject would suggest. The articles are scattered across multiple newspapers, from major metropolitan dailies like the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Argus to smaller regional papers serving the inland districts. They span several decades. They are written by different reporters working for different publications without any apparent coordination. And yet they describe, with remarkable consistency, the same types of encounters in the same types of locations, using the same language of surprise and the same structure of report and official non-response. A search of the Trove archive yields dozens of relevant articles from this period. Not all of them are about individuals of genuinely extraordinary size. Some are about Aboriginal men who were simply tall by any standard, but not extraordinary. Some are clearly embellished for the entertainment of a reading public that enjoyed tales of frontier strangeness. But within the full set of articles, there is a substantial core of reports that are not embellished, that are written in the matter-of-fact style of local news reporting, that name specific individuals and specific locations, and that describe dimensions that exceed anything that settler curiosity or journalistic embellishment would produce without some basis in physical reality. A report in the Darling Downs Gazette from 1884 describes an Aboriginal elder in the Western District of Queensland, estimated by the reporter and two other witnesses to be of a height approaching 8 feet. The report notes that the elder was well known to the local settler community and that his height had been a subject of comment for many years. The report includes an attempt at measurement, described as approximate due to the elder's unwillingness to submit to a formal measuring process, and puts the height at between 7 feet 8 inches and 8 feet 2 inches. A report in the River and Herald from 1891 describes the discovery of skeletal remains in an eroding riverbank near the Murray, that include a femur the reporter has compared to his own leg, and found to be roughly half again as long. The reporter notes that he has written to the Australian Museum in Sydney about the find and received no reply. A report in the Queenslander from 1896 describes an encounter during a survey expedition in the interior with an Aboriginal man the survey party had not previously met. A man described as of a size that none of the party had encountered before, whose height was estimated by the expedition leader at not less than 8 feet, and who showed no awareness that his dimensions were unusual or remarkable. These reports were published. They were read. They were not challenged in any surviving record by contemporaries who found them implausible. And then they settled into the archive and were, for the most part, not incorporated into the official historical record of Aboriginal Australia. The ninth item on our list is the connection between the Australian evidence and the broader global pattern of giant suppression, and what that pattern tells us about the institutional interests that have consistently managed this type of evidence across different countries in different eras. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. is the world's largest museum and research complex. It was established in 1846 and has, over its history, accumulated collections of anthropological and archaeological material from across the globe. It has also been the subject, particularly in recent decades, of sustained allegations that its anthropological collections contain skeletal material that does not fit the official scientific narrative about the maximum height of prehistoric and historical human beings, and that this material has been systematically withheld from public access and from independent examination. The allegations about the Smithsonian and giant skeletal remains have been most extensively documented in the context of North American archaeology, where accounts of large skeletal remains discovered at burial mounds and other archaeological sites in the 19th century are numerous and were widely reported in the popular press of the era. The pattern in the North American case is structurally identical to the pattern we have been examining in Australia. Newspaper reports of large remains, official collection by Smithsonian-affiliated researchers, subsequent unavailability of the material. The Australian connection to the Smithsonian is not, at first glance, obvious. The Smithsonian's primary field of activity was North America, and its international collecting activities were focused elsewhere. But the institutional relationships between the Smithsonian and the natural history institutions of the British colonial world in the late 19th century were extensive and substantive. The research networks of this period were genuinely international, and the Smithsonian maintained correspondence and exchange relationships with institutions across the British Empire, including the Australian Museum in Sydney, the Queensland Museum in Brisbane, and various smaller colonial natural history collections. These exchange relationships meant that material collected in Australia by Australian institutions could and did make its way into the Smithsonian's holdings, and vice versa. They also meant that the research protocols, the collection standards, the decisions about what to collect and what to document and what to retain were not developed independently by each institution, but were part of a shared professional culture in which the Smithsonian played a leading role. The decisions about what to do with skeletal remains of unusual dimensions, the decisions that consistently resulted in such remains being removed from public access and eventually becoming unavailable, were therefore not independent decisions made separately by the Queensland Museum and the New South Wales Museum and the Australian Museum and the Smithsonian and various other institutions around the world. They were decisions made within a shared professional framework that reached the same conclusion about this category of material in every institution where it appeared. Why that professional framework reached that conclusion consistently and across institutions that had no overt coordination around this specific issue is a question that the official history of anthropology does not address. The alternative reading, that the removal of this material from public access reflected a coordinated institutional interest in maintaining a particular narrative about human history, is uncomfortable and is easy to dismiss as conspiracy thinking. But the dismissal becomes harder to sustain as the geographic range of the consistent institutional response widens. Australia, North America, South America, parts of Africa, parts of Europe. The same pattern in every case, the same structure of report, collection, and disappearance. The 10th item on our list is the Gympie region of Queensland, which is worth an extended examination because it concentrates in a relatively small geographic area several of the threads we have been following. Gympie is a town in the Mary River Valley of southeastern Queensland, approximately 170 kilometers north of Brisbane. It became significant in the colonial era primarily because of the gold rush of 1867, which brought a substantial European population to a region that had previously seen only limited settlement. The gold rush and its aftermath created conditions under which a great deal of ground was disturbed, both by the mining operations themselves and by the agricultural and pastoral development that followed in the mining's wake. And the disturbance of the ground in the Gympie region produced finds that the official history of the region has consistently declined to incorporate into its narrative. The Gympie region is best known in alternative history circles for what has been called the Gympie Pyramid, a terraced hill structure in the outskirts of the town that some researchers have proposed is a man-made construction predating European settlement, possibly predating Aboriginal settlement of the region in the form we know it, possibly connected to civilizations of extraordinary antiquity. The mainstream archaeological establishment has not accepted these proposals, and the Gympie Pyramid debate has generated more heat than light over the years, primarily because the debate has been conducted in the register of ancient alien theories and lost civilization speculations that make it easy to dismiss. But the Gympie region's unusual qualities are not limited to the pyramid debate. They include a set of reports from the Gold Rush era and from the subsequent decades of pastoral development, of encounters with Aboriginal individuals of extraordinary size, and of the discovery of skeletal remains of unusual dimensions in the disturbed earth of the mining operations and in the burial sites exposed by agricultural development. These reports from the Gympie region are among the most specific in the Australian record, and they align, in terms of the locations they describe, with the areas of the region that are also associated with the other unusual features that have attracted alternative history researchers. The alignment is not proof of anything, but it is suggestive of a landscape that was, for reasons that may be related to its unusual human history, associated in the local tradition with beings of extraordinary size, and that produced, when its earth was disturbed by industrial-scale operations, physical evidence consistent with that tradition. The specific reports from the Gympie region include an account from a mining engineer in 1869, 2 years after the gold rush began, describing the discovery in a mine shaft of a section of human femur that the engineer measured at approximately 28 inches in length. A typical adult male femur is approximately 18 inches. The engineer's account, written in a letter to the colony's geological surveyor, is matter-of-fact and professional in tone. It is not sensationalized. It describes the find, describes its dimensions in relation to ordinary bones the engineer had encountered professionally, and asks for guidance on how to proceed. The Geological Survey's response to this letter has not survived. There are additional reports from the Gympie region in the 1880s and 1890s, as pastoral development proceeded and as the landscape was more thoroughly worked. These reports include accounts from farmers and station hands of encountering unusually large skeletal remains in the process of ploughing or fencing or dam construction, and occasional accounts of encounters with living Aboriginal individuals in the more remote parts of the region, whose dimensions struck the reporters as exceptional. The living individual accounts from the Gympie region are consistent with the accounts from other parts of Queensland in the description of elderly individuals, of individuals whose great size seemed to be an accepted feature of their identity within their community, rather than a medical anomaly, and of individuals who were encountered in the context of communities that were themselves diminishing and retreating from the areas of European settlement. The 11th item on our list concerns the families, the settler families who farmed and grazed the inland districts of Australia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the oral traditions those families preserved about what they had seen and what they had been told not to talk about. This is a category of evidence that mainstream research tends to dismiss with particular force, because family oral tradition is the least formally documented category of evidence, and because the popular culture treatment of giant stories has made the genre of family handed-down accounts seem inherently unreliable. But the dismissal is worth examining, because the dismissal of family oral tradition as evidence is selective. When family oral tradition supports the official history, it is called living memory, first-hand testimony, cultural heritage. When it challenges the official history, it is called folklore, legend, tall tale, the natural tendency of rural communities to embellish. The settler families of inland Queensland and New South Wales include, among their number, families whose accounts of encounters with Aboriginal individuals of extraordinary size were preserved across generations with a specificity that is inconsistent with ordinary embellishment. Embellished stories get more dramatic over time. The family accounts in question do not get more dramatic. They get more specific as details are remembered and added, but they do not inflate the central claim. The individuals described in these accounts do not grow to 12 or 15 feet across generations of retelling. They remain consistently in the range of 8 to 9 feet, with the physical characteristics of elderly Aboriginal individuals rather than the characteristics of supernatural beings. Several of these families, approached by researchers in the 20th century, provided consistent and detailed accounts of specific encounters on specific properties in specific years. The details they provided could be cross-checked against other documentary evidence in some cases, and in those cases, the cross-checking did not find inconsistencies. The families did not seek publicity for their accounts. They were not connected to the alternative history community that has subsequently taken an interest in this material. They were farming families with no particular stake in the question of whether giant Aboriginal Australians existed, other than the stake created by the fact that some of their members had seen one. The 12th item on our list is the colonial museum system, and the specific history of what happened to Aboriginal skeletal collections in Australian museums from the late 19th century to the present day. The repatriation of Aboriginal human remains from museum collections has been an active issue in Australian politics and cultural heritage management since the 1980s, and the process of repatriation has produced a body of documentation about what Australian and overseas museums actually held that is, when examined carefully, itself a source of evidence about the broader questions we have been examining. The documentation produced by repatriation processes includes inventories of museum holdings. Those inventories from institutions including the British Museum, the Natural History Museum in London, the Smithsonian Institution, the Australian Museum, the Museum Victoria, the South Australian Museum and others, listed dimensions for skeletal remains that in some cases exceeded what the official anthropology of the relevant period had documented for the Aboriginal populations of the relevant regions. The inventories were produced to support repatriation, not to raise questions about the dimensions of the remains, and so the anomalous dimensions were not flagged as anomalous in the inventories themselves. They appear as entries in lists, with measurements recorded as a matter of procedure. Researchers who have gone through those inventories with attention to the measurements have found entries that describe bone lengths inconsistent with the dimensions of ordinary adult human skeletons. Some of those entries describe remains that have since been repatriated and reburied, which means the physical remains are no longer available for independent examination. Some describe remains that are still held in museum collections, but that are listed as restricted from access. Some describe remains that are listed as lost or unaccounted for. The pattern is consistent. The physical evidence that would most directly address the question of whether unusually large Aboriginal individuals existed is, by a variety of routes, unavailable for examination. The 13th item on our list is the work of researchers in the 20th century who approached this material seriously, and who encountered, in varying degrees, institutional resistance to their inquiries. The researcher we have already mentioned, the one who found the reference to the 1898 expedition in a private letter collection, and spent 4 years following the documentary trail, published a paper in 1979 that has become difficult to find in library systems. The paper described the structure of what the researcher called systematic documentation suppression in colonial Australian records relating to unusual Aboriginal individuals. The paper was peer-reviewed, was accepted by a Journal of Australian History Studies, and was published. It was not widely cited. Requests for the paper through standard academic interlibrary loan channels have, in several documented cases, produced responses indicating that the journal issue in question is not held by the requesting institution or is unavailable for reproduction. The researcher died in 1994. His papers are held by his family. His family has, on occasion, been contacted by people interested in his work and has confirmed that the papers exist and include substantial material that was not published in the 1979 paper. The family has not, to date, made the papers publicly available. A second researcher, working in the 1990s, approached the question from the direction of the Aboriginal oral tradition rather than the colonial archive. This researcher, an anthropologist with fieldwork experience in several Aboriginal communities in Queensland, accumulated over a decade of fieldwork a body of recorded testimony from Aboriginal elders about the large beings and their traditions. The testimony was specific, detailed, and consistent across communities that had no contemporary contact with each other. The anthropologist prepared a monograph based on this testimony, submitted it to an academic publisher, and received a rejection based on peer review that characterized the monograph's central claims as outside the bounds of what the reviewer considered credible anthropological inquiry. The monograph was not published. The researcher left academic anthropology. The recordings on which the monograph was based are, as far as is known, still held by the researcher, who has declined interviews about the work. A third researcher, a geologist rather than a historian or anthropologist, became interested in the question through a different route. This researcher had been conducting surveys in inland Queensland in the early 2000s and had encountered, in the process of survey work, a geological formation that included what appeared to be an in situ human femur of exceptional length. The formation was not in a burial mound or any other context that would indicate deliberate interment. The femur appeared to have been deposited in the natural sedimentary sequence, which would imply an age considerably greater than any official account of human habitation in the region would accommodate. The geologist reported the find to the relevant state authority and was told that the find would be assessed. The assessment, when it arrived, determined that the feature was not a bone, but a geological formation resembling a bone, a pseudomorph. The geologist disagreed with this assessment and said so. The dispute was not resolved in any public forum. The site was subsequently disturbed by a road construction project. The geologist has spoken about this experience in interviews given to websites focused on alternative Australian history, and his account is available online, where it exists alongside much less credible material in a context that makes it easy to dismiss. The 14th item on our list is the geological record, and what the geology of Australia can tell us about the timeline of human habitation on the continent, and the possibility that that habitation included populations whose physical characteristics differed from those documented in the era of European settlement. The archaeology of human habitation in Australia is a field that has undergone significant revision over the past several decades, as new dating techniques and new discoveries have pushed the established timeline of human presence on the continent further and further back. The current scientific consensus places the arrival of the first humans in Australia at approximately 65,000 years ago, which is substantially older than the estimates that were standard a generation ago. The revision of this timeline has not been without controversy, and the controversies have revealed, among other things, that the official scientific community's willingness to accept evidence of very old human habitation in Australia has been inconsistent, sometimes accepting dates that seemed implausible to the previous generation of researchers, and sometimes resisting dates that the physical evidence would seem to support. Within this extended timeline of human presence on the continent, there is room for physical diversity that the relatively brief period of European contact and documentation does not capture. 65,000 years is an enormous span of time during which the Australian continent experienced significant climatic changes, geographic changes in the coastline and interior waterways, and ecological changes that would have created very different selective pressures on human populations in different eras. The humans who first arrived in Australia 65,000 years ago were not necessarily identical in their physical characteristics to the Aboriginal Australians encountered by European settlers in the 18th and 19th centuries. The fossil record for human habitation in Australia from this extended period is fragmentary. The preservation conditions for skeletal remains in the Australian environment are generally poor outside of very specific geological contexts, and the rate of discovery of genuinely ancient human remains in Australia has been low relative to other parts of the world. The remains that have been found include, most famously, the Mungo Man and Mungo Lady specimens from Lake Mungo in New South Wales, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, and various other specimens from different regions and periods. What the fossil record does not include, at least in the officially documented and publicly accessible corpus, is skeletal material from the late prehistoric period, from the last few thousand years, that would represent the physical population of the continent in the era immediately before European contact. The gap between the ancient fossil material and the historical record of the post-contact period is precisely the gap in which the large individuals described in the Aboriginal oral tradition would have been present and in which the individuals described in the early European accounts would have been born. The gap is not necessarily suspicious in itself. Skeletal preservation in Australia is genuinely difficult, and the absence of remains from a particular period can often be explained by taphonomic factors rather than suppression. But when the absence of remains coincides so precisely with the period most relevant to the question being asked, and when that coincidence is consistent with a pattern of institutional behaviour that we have already documented in other parts of the evidentiary record, the taphonomic explanation begins to seem insufficient. The 15th item on our list is the final question, the question of why it matters that the last Australian giant was photographed in 1898 and that the photograph was then seized, and what the answer to that question tells us about the relationship between official history and the physical past. It matters for several reasons. It matters because the Aboriginal Australians, whose traditions preserve the memory of these large beings, are the inheritors of the oldest continuous human culture on the planet. When their traditions describe things that happened, we have learned repeatedly and in domains that have nothing to do with giant human beings, that those descriptions encode real information about real events. The consistent presence of large beings in the traditions of multiple Aboriginal nations across the continent is not a trivial data point. It is a signal from a system of knowledge that has proven itself reliable, and the appropriate response to that signal is inquiry, not dismissal. It matters because the physical evidence, the bones in the burial mounds, the femurs in the mining shafts, the skeletal remains in the museum inventories, though it is now mostly inaccessible, was documented before it became inaccessible. The documentation is in the archive is partly accessible, and the documentation, taken as a whole, is consistent with a human presence on the Australian continent that included individuals of dimensions outside the range that official science currently considers possible for the species. It matters because the institutional response to this evidence, the pattern of collection and suppression, and unavailability that we have traced across 7 decades and multiple institutions, is itself a data point. Institutions do not systematically suppress evidence that does not threaten something they are invested in protecting. The consistency and the reach of the suppression imply that the evidence being suppressed was genuinely threatening to something important, and the question of what it was threatening is, in itself, a significant question. It matters, finally, because the photograph of 1898 was not simply a curiosity. It was a record of a human being who existed, who was known to his community, who stood willingly before a camera and allowed his image to be captured, and who was then, by the act of seizure that followed the photograph's development, erased from the accessible historical record of his own country. That erasure is a wrong, not primarily in the sense of a scientific wrong, a failure to preserve evidence, though it is that. It is a wrong in a more fundamental sense. A person existed, a community existed, a tradition of knowledge about that person and what he represented existed, and all of that was taken away, officially, by the action of a government whose interest in the narrative it was constructing was greater than its interest in the reality it was suppressing. The photograph no longer exists in any public archive. But the absence of the photograph is itself a form of record. It records the presence of something important enough to suppress. It records the action of people who understood what they were doing. And it records, for those who are paying attention, the continued existence of a question that the official history of Australia has not answered, and has not answered because to answer it would require acknowledging that the official history was wrong. That what it called primitive was ancient, that what it called dying was in fact being killed, and that what it called a superstition was a memory. The old man stood in the photograph. He was real. His community was real. The tradition that explained who he was and what his existence meant was real. The people who took the photograph away knew all of this, and they took it anyway. That is the story. That is why it matters. And that, as we let these words settle into the quiet around us, is the place where we leave it for tonight. The questions remain open. The archive remains partly accessible. The Aboriginal communities whose traditions preserve this knowledge are still here, still carrying what their ancestors preserved, still waiting for a history that includes what they know. Sleep well, the questions will be here when you return to them, and so will we. There are other threads in this story that have not yet been pulled. We have covered 15 items in our list, and each of those items opens onto others, onto rooms in the archive that have not been entered, onto accounts that have not been read in decades, onto traditions that continue to be preserved in communities that have waited a very long time for the wider world to take them seriously. The 16th item concerns the water and the relationship between the large beings of the Australian tradition and the rivers and coastal systems that form the backbone of human habitation on the continent for 60,000 years. Water in Australia is not evenly distributed. The continent is the driest inhabited continent on Earth, and the distribution of water has always determined the distribution of human populations across its landscape. The river systems of the interior, the Murray-Darling Basin, the Cooper Creek system, the rivers and seasonal watercourses of Queensland and the Northern Territory and the Kimberley were not simply sources of drinking water. They were the corridors of movement, the systems of connection between communities, the routes along which knowledge and people and trade goods and genetic material moved across a continent that was otherwise immense and difficult to traverse. The Aboriginal traditions that describe large beings consistently associate them with river country and with the deeper, more permanent water sources in the interior. This association is not incidental. The large beings of the Wiradjuri tradition are specifically associated with the river systems of central New South Wales. The large beings of the Bundjalung tradition are associated with the river country of northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. The large beings in the traditions of the Kamilaroi people are associated with the upper reaches of the river systems that flow through their traditional country. The pattern suggests, if you follow it carefully, that the communities who preserved these traditions were describing populations that were not scattered randomly across the landscape, but that were concentrated in specific ecological niches in the most productive and water-rich parts of the interior. This is consistent with what we would expect of a large body population with high caloric needs. Large bodies require more food and more water than smaller ones. A human being of 9 feet in height and the proportional body mass that accompanies that height would need substantially more calories and more water than an ordinary adult human, and would naturally be found in the parts of the landscape most capable of supporting those needs. The river country of inland Australia was, before European settlement, the most productive part of the continent in terms of food resources. The river system supported large populations of fish, water birds, and the animals that came to water. The floodplains and river margins supported dense plant communities that provided food resources unavailable in the drier interior. A population of large-bodied humans in this landscape would not have been ecologically impossible. It would have been ecologically reasonable. The 17th item on our list is the question of the photographs that were not seized, the visual records that survived the institutional suppression and that exist in various forms of accessibility, in private collections and public archives in places that the suppression apparatus of the colonial government did not reach. The colonial government's ability to control the photographic record of the interior of Australia in the 1890s was extensive but not absolute. Photography was by this period sufficiently widespread that the government could not control every photographic plate exposed in the colony. The professional photographers who worked the inland districts of Queensland and New South Wales in the 1890s were not employees of the government. They were private businessmen who worked for whoever would pay them, who kept their own archives, and who were not necessarily aware that certain categories of their images might be of interest to official institutions. The private photographic archives from this period are scattered and incompletely catalogued. Many were dispersed after the deaths of their creators, sold at auction, donated to local historical societies, kept by families, occasionally lost or destroyed. The major state archives and the National Library of Australia hold substantial photographic collections from this period, but these collections are not comprehensively documented, and researchers who have worked through them have reported finding images that are not listed in the official catalogues. The possibility that photographic evidence of large Aboriginal individuals survived the institutional suppression because it was taken by photographers who were not connected to the official research network is not remote. The 1898 expedition that produced the famous seized photograph was not the only expedition to the interior of Queensland in that decade. There were other expeditions, other researchers, other photographers, and not all of them would have been subject to the same institutional pressure that was applied to the 1898 party. There are accounts from researchers who have worked in private photographic archives of images that have not been published, but that appear to show Aboriginal individuals of unusual size. These accounts are anecdotal. They describe images that the researchers saw once, in collections that they subsequently could not access again, or in collections whose current location they cannot determine. This is not proof, but it is consistent with the overall pattern, the pattern of evidence that is there, that is encountered, and that then becomes unavailable through the ordinary processes of archival chaos rather than through deliberate suppression. The 18th item on our list is the connection between the Australian evidence and the broader question of what the human species looked like in the deep past, before the relatively recent convergence toward the height ranges that modern anthropology treats as the species norm. Human beings have not always been the height we are now. The archaeological record shows significant variation in human stature across different periods and different populations. The tall stature associated with the Cro-Magnon populations of prehistoric Europe, the variation in stature across different archaeological populations in Asia and Africa, the evidence from various sites of individuals who were significantly taller than the average of their contemporary populations, all of this is part of the official archaeological record, though it is a part that receives relatively little popular attention. The possibility that human populations in the deep past of Australia included individuals of heights significantly greater than those documented in the post-contact era is not, in this context, a radical proposal. It is the application to Australia of a pattern of physical variability that the archaeological record documents globally. The question is not whether human beings can be that tall, because the answer is clearly yes. The question is whether a population of such individuals existed in Australia in the period described by the Aboriginal traditions and the early European accounts, and persisted into the late 19th century, and was photographed in 1898. The 19th item on our list is the silence of the landscape itself, the way that certain parts of the Australian interior retain, in their physical geography and in the behaviour of the communities that live near them, traces of an awareness of something that happened there, that the official history does not record. The inland communities of Queensland and New South Wales, the small towns and farming communities in the districts we have been discussing, have their own relationship to this material. The material is not entirely suppressed at the local level in the way that it is suppressed at the institutional level. Local histories, the privately printed volumes of local history that community groups produce to mark significant anniversaries, sometimes contain material that would never pass the peer review of an academic journal. They contain accounts passed down through families, accounts of finds made during agricultural development, accounts of encounters on specific properties. These local histories are not widely distributed. They are printed in small runs, held in local libraries and historical societies and private collections. They are not digitized and are not searchable through National Archive systems. But they exist and they contain, in aggregate, a substantial body of testimony about the landscape of the Australian interior that includes material relevant to the question we have been examining. The communities that live closest to the locations most consistently associated with large being traditions and with reports of unusual skeletal discoveries have a particular quality in their relationship to this material. They do not talk about it in formal or public contexts. They do not bring it up to strangers, but among themselves and occasionally with researchers who have spent sufficient time in the community to be trusted, they acknowledge what they know. What they know is that the landscape around them has a history that the textbooks do not include, and that the textbooks do not include it, not because it did not happen, but because the people who write the textbooks have decided that it should not be in them. The 20th item on our list, the final item in our formal count, though not the end of what we have to say, concerns the question of what the existence of these large individuals would mean for the Aboriginal communities, whose traditions preserve their memory, and what acknowledgement of that existence would require from the institutions that suppressed it. For the Aboriginal communities, the large beings of the tradition are not separate from the broader framework of their knowledge about the country they have inhabited for 60,000 years. They are part of a comprehensive understanding of the human landscape of the continent, an understanding that includes knowledge about what the country has been, what it can be, and what the people who live in it carry in terms of obligation and relationship. To acknowledge that this element of the tradition records something real is to acknowledge that the entire tradition is a reliable record of real things, which has profound implications for the standing of Aboriginal knowledge in every domain, from land management to ecological history, to the understanding of human origins in Australia. For the institutions that suppress the evidence, acknowledgement would require something considerably more difficult. It would require an accounting for what was taken and where it went. It would require an honest assessment of the motivations that drove the suppression, motivations that were rooted in the racist assumptions of colonial science and colonial governance. It would require the opening of records that have been kept closed for reasons that, in the light of that accounting, would reveal themselves as indefensible. This is why the suppression has persisted as long as it has. The cost of acknowledgement is not simply the revision of some obscure corner of historical anthropology. It is the acknowledgement of a systematic and deliberate falsification of the historical record, conducted by institutions whose credibility depends on being seen as custodians of truth rather than managers of convenient narrative. The photograph was taken in 1898. The man who stood in it was real. The photograph was seized because its existence was inconvenient, and the inconvenience has not gone away in the century and more that has passed since the seizure, because the photograph is gone, but the questions it would have answered are not. Those questions are still here. In the Aboriginal traditions that have preserved them across generations, in the archive fragments that the suppression apparatus missed, in the family memories of settler communities who saw things they were told not to discuss, in the gaps in the museum inventories and the colonial archives and the library catalogues, the shaped absences where evidence should be and is not. The landscape remembers even when the institutions do not. The traditions survive even when the photographs are seized. And the questions persist with the patience of things that have been waiting a very long time to be heard. Through every official silence and every institutional dismissal and every peer review, that returns a verdict of outside the bounds of credible inquiry. We have been listening tonight to those questions. We have been sitting with them in the quiet that opens up around a story that has not been fully told, letting the details settle, letting the patterns become visible, letting the weight of the accumulated evidence rest in the mind without forcing it to arrive at conclusions it is not yet ready to form. This is how the most important questions are properly held. Not forced to premature resolution, not dismissed for lack of certainty, held carefully with the knowledge that the holding itself is a form of respect, both for the evidence and for the people whose lives and whose traditions are entangled with it. The last Australian giant was photographed in 1898. The photographs were seized. The man who stood in them lived and died in a community that knew who he was and what his existence meant. That community has not forgotten. The tradition they preserve has carried the memory of what he represented across the decades since the photograph was taken away. Not as a curiosity, not as an entertainment, but as a record of something real that the world around them spent a very long time refusing to acknowledge. We are still in that long time, but it is passing. The archives are being opened, slowly and incompletely, but opened. The traditions are being recorded and studied with a seriousness that earlier generations of researchers did not bring to them. The questions are being asked in places and by people who have the skills and the access to follow them to better answers than we have been able to reach in this account. The photograph is gone, but the questions it would have answered are becoming harder and harder to suppress. Rest with that for now. Let the story settle. Tomorrow the archive will still be there, and the traditions will still be there, and the shaped absences in the official record will still be there, waiting for the questions that are patient enough to find them. The 17th question in this long inquiry is one that does not have a neat placement in the list, but that needs to be asked here, in the quieter register of a story winding toward its close. What do we lose when we lose a photograph? A photograph is not simply an image. It is a record of a specific moment in time, a moment that cannot be recreated, a moment in which certain things were true that the photograph would have made undeniable. The photograph taken in 1898 in the Queensland interior was a record of the existence of a man, of his height, of his presence in the landscape, of the presence of the European researchers beside him who provided the scale that made his dimensions unmistakable, of the landscape itself, the Australian interior in the late 19th century, unchanged in its essential character from the deep time that preceded European settlement. All of that is gone. Not because a fire destroyed it, not because the chemical instability of early photographic materials consumed it, but because someone decided that it should not be seen. That decision has meant, for 125 years and counting, that the man in the photograph has had no existence in the official record of his country. His height, which was part of who he was, has had no existence. His community's acknowledgement of what he represented has had no existence. This is a form of erasure that goes beyond the destruction of evidence. It is the destruction of a person's place in history. And it was done deliberately by people who understood what they were doing because the evidence the photograph provided was incompatible with the story those people needed to tell. The 21st item on our extended list, because the list continues beyond its formal count as long as the evidence continues to present itself, concerns the specific mechanism by which photographs were controlled and suppressed in colonial Australia, and what that mechanism tells us about the institutional infrastructure that was in place to manage this type of information. Photography in 1898 was not the ubiquitous, democratized technology it is today. It required equipment that was expensive and not easily portable, chemicals that required careful handling and specific conditions for development, and a technical knowledge that was not widely distributed in the population. This meant that photographic records of events in the remote interior of Australia in 1898 were produced by a relatively small number of people with relatively specialized skills, and that the infrastructure for developing and reproducing those photographs was concentrated in the major towns and cities. This concentration of the photographic infrastructure meant that controlling the photographic record of events in the interior was, logistically, not especially difficult for a colonial government with the motivation to do so. Photographs taken in the field had to be developed. Development required facilities that were, in 1898, limited in number and location. A government with relationships to those facilities, or with the ability to apply pressure to the people who ran them, had the ability to intervene in the photographic record at the development stage, before copies were made, and before the original plates were in the hands of multiple parties. This is almost certainly the mechanism that was used in 1898. The expedition's photographic plates were taken to Brisbane for development. At some point in that process, the colonial government became aware of what the plates contained and intervened. The intervention happened before the development was complete, or at the development stage before prints were made and distributed, because no prints appear in the record. If prints had been made and distributed before the intervention, it would be extremely difficult to account for the complete absence of any copy of the photograph from any private collection or archive in the subsequent century. The zero survival rate of the photograph is itself evidence of the early stage of the intervention. Things that are widely distributed survive even aggressive suppression. Things that exist in only one or two copies, in controlled locations, can be suppressed completely. The photograph of 1898 was suppressed completely. This implies that the intervention happened early, and that the number of copies was very small, possibly limited to the original plates and a single set of prints. The 22nd item on our list is the question of the interpreters, the Aboriginal individuals who served as interpreters for the 1898 expedition, and who would have been present at the encounter with the photographed individual, and who would have had the most direct and complete understanding of what was happening and what the encounter meant. The interpreters are essentially absent from the surviving accounts of the expedition. They appear in those accounts as functional presences, as the mechanism by which communication occurred. But they are not named, not described as individuals, not given any presence in the record beyond their instrumental function. This is consistent with the general practice of colonial expedition accounts in this period, which treated Aboriginal participants in European expeditions as staff rather than as people, and which did not consider their perspectives or their knowledge as worthy of documentation. But the interpreters at this encounter would have understood something that the European researchers did not fully understand. They would have understood, from the tradition they carried, who the old man in the photograph was and what his existence meant within the framework of Aboriginal knowledge about the country. They would have been able to explain if anyone had asked them, and if the explanation had been recorded, the tradition that contextualized his existence, the history that his presence in the landscape represented, and the significance of the encounter in terms of what it meant for the future of what he represented. Nobody asked, or if they asked, the answers were not recorded. The interpreters left no trace in the surviving accounts beyond their functional role. This loss, the loss of the interpreter's knowledge about this encounter, may be the most significant loss of the 1898 episode. The photograph would have shown us what the old man looked like. The interpreter's knowledge would have told us who he was. The 23rd item on our list is the language, the specific languages of the Aboriginal nations, whose traditional country included the locations most associated with the large being traditions, and what those languages contain that is relevant to the question we have been examining. Language preserves things that other forms of record do not. The vocabulary of a language encodes the categories that its speakers consider significant, and the persistence of specific vocabulary items across generations tells us something about the persistence of the things those vocabulary items describe. Languages do not maintain vocabulary for things that do not exist. They maintain vocabulary for things that their speakers encounter or have recently encountered, and they preserve in the specialized registers of ceremonial and traditional language vocabulary for things that were once encountered and that remain significant in the tradition, even after they are no longer present in the daily environment. The languages of several Aboriginal nations in Queensland and New South Wales contain vocabulary that describes beings of large human form in specific and differentiated ways that go beyond a simple word for a big person. The differentiation in the vocabulary suggests that the speakers of these languages were not describing a vague category, but a specific type of being with specific characteristics that were sufficiently consistent and well known to require dedicated terminology. The preservation of this vocabulary in traditional languages that have been under enormous pressure from the processes of colonization and language loss is itself significant. Languages retain vocabulary for things that the community considers important to maintain. The fact that vocabulary relating to large beings survived in these languages through the period of maximum pressure on the languages themselves suggests that the traditions relating to these beings were considered sufficiently important to preserve even at the cost of other vocabulary that was lost. Linguists who have worked with these languages have documented the vocabulary in question as part of broader language documentation projects. The documentation is in academic archives. The analysis that would connect the vocabulary to the broader questions of the large being tradition has not been done, or if it has been done, it has not been published. This is a pattern that appears in nearly every disciplinary domain relevant to this inquiry. The raw evidence is documented. The analysis that would connect the evidence to the larger pattern is absent. The absence of the analysis is not accidental. It reflects the operation of disciplinary gatekeeping, the process by which the questions that can be asked and the connections that can be made are determined by the frameworks that define what constitutes legitimate inquiry. The 24th item on our list is the photographic tradition itself. The way that the act of photographing Aboriginal Australians in the late 19th century was embedded in a set of assumptions and practices that affected not only what was photographed, but what happened to the photographs afterward. Colonial photography of Aboriginal Australians was, from its earliest period, a practice deeply entangled with the assumptions of the era about the nature and future of the Aboriginal population. The photographs were taken within a framework that understood them as documentation of a dying race, as records of a type of humanity that was passing away and should be preserved for scientific study before it disappeared entirely. This framework shaped the choices of what to photograph, who to ask to stand for photographs, and how to preserve and present the photographs afterward. Within this framework, the existence of an individual who was 8 or 9 feet tall was not simply physically anomalous. It was ideologically disruptive. The dying race narrative required that the Aboriginal population be presented as diminishing in every sense, as smaller and weaker and less vital than the European population that was supposedly replacing it. An elderly Aboriginal man of 9 feet in height, standing beside European researchers who barely reached his chest, was an image that the dying race narrative could not accommodate. It was an image that reversed the visual rhetoric of the entire colonial photographic project, that made the large, powerful thing Aboriginal and the small, ordinary things European. This is why the photograph could not survive. Not simply because it raised questions about physical dimensions, but because it visually embodied a reversal of the colonial narrative that the institutions of that narrative could not permit to circulate. The 25th item on our list, and the last item in this accounting, though not the last word on the subject, is the present, the current state of the inquiry, and the question of where the evidence leads from here. We are in a period in which the relationship between official history and the communities it has silenced is undergoing genuine and significant revision. The process of returning Aboriginal human remains to Aboriginal communities, imperfect and slow as it has been, has produced as a side effect documentation of what the museums held that has opened questions that official anthropology is not yet prepared to answer. The digitization of colonial archives has made material accessible that was effectively inaccessible for most of the 20th century. The growing academic seriousness about Aboriginal oral tradition as a form of reliable historical record has opened the possibility of genuine interdisciplinary inquiry in a way that was not possible a generation ago. These developments do not mean that the answers are imminent. They mean that the conditions under which the questions can be seriously pursued are better than they have been in a very long time. They mean that the next generation of researchers, working with better tools, better access, and better institutional frameworks for what counts as legitimate inquiry, has a genuine chance to follow the threads we have been pulling tonight to places that we have not been able to reach. The photograph of 1898 is gone, but the old man who stood in it lived in a community that knew who he was. That community is still here, in the form of the nations and the people who carry the traditions he was part of. Those traditions have not been suppressed. They have been waiting, with the patience that is appropriate to things that have been carried across 60,000 years, for the questions to become serious enough to deserve their answers. We hope that what we have shared tonight is a step, however small, toward that seriousness. We hope that the questions stay with you in the way that good questions do, as companions for the days ahead, as reasons to look more carefully at the official record, to listen more attentively to the traditions that the official record has tried to silence, and to hold open, with patience and without forcing, the possibility that the history of the oldest continent on Earth contains things that we have been told it does not. The land is very old, the people who have lived on it are very old. The memory of what that land has been is very old, and it has been kept alive by people whose commitment to keeping it alive has survived everything that was done to end it. That commitment is its own form of testimony, and it is, in the end, the most important evidence of all. Rest now. The archive will be there tomorrow. The traditions will be there tomorrow. And so will the questions, patient and open, waiting for the attention they deserve. Good night. There is a quality to late 19th century Australia that is difficult to fully recover from the archive alone. It was a continent in the process of becoming something, a place where the future was being negotiated in real time, where the forces of settlement and tradition and commerce and violence were all operating simultaneously in the same landscape, each laying claim to the same soil from which the other forces also drew their sustenance and their justification. The people who moved through that landscape, the settlers and the station hands, and the surveyors and the Aboriginal communities who watched all of this arriving on the country they had known for 60,000 years, all of them carried knowledge that the official record was never designed to fully capture. What we have been doing tonight, and what we will continue doing as we move through the remaining hours of this account, is trying to recover some of that knowledge from the places it was deposited, from the private letters, from the local histories, from the Aboriginal traditions that survived because the communities that carried them had reasons deeper than any colonial pressure to keep carrying them, from the gaps and absences in the official record that are themselves, as we have seen repeatedly, a form of evidence about what was there and why it had to be removed. We have reached the point in this account where the formal list has been completed, where the numbered items have been worked through, but where the story has not yet found its natural resting place. There are things that need to be said about how this all connects, about the texture of the evidence taken as a whole, about the experience of sitting with this material and understanding what it asks of the person who takes it seriously. Let us begin with the texture. The evidence we have been examining tonight is not the evidence of dramatic discovery. It is not the evidence of a single irrefutable find that resolves the question once and for all. It is the evidence of accumulation, of a pattern that becomes visible only when you hold many separate things in view simultaneously. Things that individually might be dismissed as coincidence or error or embellishment, but that together constitute something different in kind from any of its individual parts. The station manager who wrote to the Colonial Geological Survey in 1882 about the bones he found in the eroding riverbank did not know about the mining engineer in Gympie, who had written to the Geological Surveyor in 1869 about the femur in the mine shaft. The families in the inland districts who preserved accounts of encounters with large Aboriginal individuals did not know about the Aboriginal oral traditions in other parts of the continent that preserved descriptions of the same type of being in similar language. The newspaper reporters who filed accounts of extraordinary individuals in the 1880s and 1890s were not coordinating with each other across the distances that separated their papers and their districts. And yet the accounts converge, not perfectly, not without variation, not in the way that a coordinated fabrication converges, where all the details are the same because they all came from the same source. They converge in the way that independent observations of the same real phenomenon converge, with variations that reflect the different perspectives, distances, and contexts of the observers, and with a central core of agreement that the variations cannot obscure. That convergence is what gives the overall picture its weight. Individual accounts are easy to dismiss. The convergence is harder. Let us also spend some time with the specific quality of the Aboriginal traditions we have been discussing, because these traditions are not only evidence of a factual kind, they are also evidence of a different relationship to the question of what the human past contains, a relationship that has something to teach the Western historical tradition about how to hold knowledge across long periods of time. The Aboriginal tradition of Australia is the oldest continuous tradition of knowledge preservation on the planet. 60,000 years is a span of time that makes everything else in human history look recent. The people who have maintained that tradition across those 60,000 years did not do so because it was easy. They did so because the tradition carried things that were important to carry, that could not be allowed to drop, that the communities depending on the tradition needed to have available when they needed it. Knowledge is preserved in oral tradition because the community preserving it has decided that the knowledge matters enough to carry. The decisions about what to preserve and what to let go are made over generations by people who understand the landscape and the needs of the community in a way that is far more intimate and far more long-term than anything a modern institution can replicate. When a traditional oral culture preserves, across thousands of years, detailed accounts of beings of extraordinary size that were once part of the human landscape of the continent, the appropriate response is not to ask whether the accounts are literally true in every detail. The appropriate response is to ask what reality they encode and how to understand that reality correctly. The reality they encode is, we have argued tonight, the historical presence of a population of unusually large humans in the Australian interior, a population that was in decline by the time of earliest European contact, and that was essentially gone, or present only in isolated and very aged individuals, like the man in the 1898 photograph by the end of the 19th century. This is a specific and testable historical claim. It is a claim that the physical evidence, fragmentary and suppressed as it is consistent with. It is a claim that the European eyewitness accounts are consistent with, and it is a claim that the Aboriginal oral traditions across multiple nations are consistent with. The consistency does not make it certain. Nothing in the historical record makes anything certain, because history is always a reconstruction from partial evidence, and the partiality of the evidence shapes the reconstruction in ways that are never fully visible to the reconstructor. But the consistency makes it serious. It makes it worth pursuing with the full weight of the scholarly attention and the archival resources and the interdisciplinary creativity that the question deserves. Now, let us turn to something that has been present throughout this account, but that has not been directly addressed: the question of who benefits from the suppression and who loses. The question of who benefits is, in this case, relatively straightforward. The colonial administration that conducted the suppression benefited from it directly, in the sense that the suppression protected the narrative framework on which its authority depended. The dying race narrative was not merely a description, it was a justification. It justified the dispossession of Aboriginal communities by establishing that those communities were already fading, that the process of replacement was natural rather than violent, that the future the colonial project was building was a better future than the one it was replacing. Evidence that contradicted this narrative, evidence of Aboriginal physical vitality, of Aboriginal knowledge systems that encoded real information, of Aboriginal communities that contained individuals of dimensions that exceeded anything the European population could match, threatened the narrative at its foundation. An anthropology that acknowledged extraordinary physical diversity in the Aboriginal population, that documented individuals of 9 feet in height in Queensland communities in the 1890s, would have been an anthropology that could not simultaneously maintain the dying race narrative. The two frameworks were incompatible, and the choice between them in the institutional environment of colonial Australia in the 1890s was not a choice that was going to be made in favour of the evidence. The question of who loses is harder to answer briefly, because the losses are distributed across many different people and many different types of loss. The Aboriginal communities lost the most immediately and most directly. They lost documentation of their own people. They lost the scientific acknowledgement of what their traditions had preserved. They lost the record of an individual who was part of their community, whose existence in the photographic record would have been, whatever else it did, a statement that he had been present, that he had existed, that his life was real and documented. The photograph's seizure erased him from the accessible record of his own country, in a country where the erasure of Aboriginal individuals from the record was a systematic project with a long history. The scientific community lost something different. It lost the opportunity to ask questions that would have led, had they been seriously pursued in 1898, to a significantly different understanding of human physical diversity and human prehistory in Australia. Those questions could have been the starting point for a century of inquiry that might have produced, by now, a substantially more complete picture of the human past on the continent. Instead, the suppression of the evidence meant that the questions were not asked, and the century of inquiry that did not happen means that we are standing in the early 21st century, still at the beginning of an inquiry that should have been well advanced. The people reading and listening to accounts like this one, tonight, or whenever this reaches them, lose something too. They lose the certainty that the official record is as complete and as honest as they were taught to believe. This is not a small loss. The assumption that the institutions entrusted with the preservation of historical knowledge have preserved it faithfully and made it accessible honestly is an assumption that most people make without examining it, and that most people would prefer to continue making because the alternative is uncomfortable. The alternative is that the official record is managed, that it contains, systematically, more than ordinary incompleteness, that the gaps are shaped and the shaping reflects the interests of the institutions doing the managing. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how institutional power works in every era and in every domain, tending to preserve what serves the institution and allowing to disappear what threatens it. The management is usually not deliberate in every instance. It is usually the product of institutional culture, of shared assumptions about what matters and what does not, of peer review systems that define legitimate questions in ways that exclude uncomfortable ones. But in the case we have been examining tonight, the management was, at least in some instances, deliberate. The photograph was deliberately taken. The decision to take it was made by people who understood what they were doing and why. The record of that decision has, in the way of records of deliberate suppression, not survived, but the absence of the photograph and the pattern of other absences around it bears the shape of intention. Let us talk for a while about the experience of sitting with a shaped absence. A shaped absence is different from an ordinary absence. When something is simply lost, the gap it leaves is irregular, because loss is irregular, because the processes that destroy things are not directed by intelligence towards specific ends. A shaped absence has a different quality. It has edges that are too smooth, boundaries that are too precise, a form that reflects the form of the thing that was removed rather than the randomness of ordinary entropy. The Australian evidence for large Aboriginal individuals has shaped absences in this sense. The gaps in the Murray River records are not random. They occur specifically where the evidence was most concrete, where physical remains had been reported and official attention had been promised. The gaps in the Queensland Museum inventory correspond specifically to the categories of material most relevant to the question. The gaps in the Colonial Archive correspond specifically to the periods and the locations that the other evidence points toward as significant. These shaped absences are, as we have said, a form of evidence, but they are also a form of communication. They communicate the awareness on the part of the people who created them that the material being suppressed was genuinely significant. You do not create a shaped absence around something that does not matter. The care with which the suppression was conducted is, paradoxically, evidence of the importance of what was being suppressed. This is a strange and somewhat vertiginous form of reasoning, but it is not invalid. The significance of what was suppressed can be inferred from the significance of the effort made to suppress it. And the effort made to suppress the evidence of large Aboriginal individuals in Australia was substantial, sustained, and institutional. It was not the effort of a single administrator overreacting to an unusual find. It was the effort of a system. There is a word for systems that consistently and across time manage the information available to the populations they govern. There are many words, depending on your framework and your degree of charity toward the institutions involved. The word we will use tonight is careful. The colonial administration of Australia was careful about this particular category of information in a way that it was not careful about many other categories. That carefulness is worth examining and understanding because it tells us something about the stakes. The stakes were not simply scientific credibility. They were not simply the reputation of individual researchers or individual institutions. The stakes were the legitimacy of the colonial project itself, the project of occupying and transforming a continent whose original human inhabitants had been there for 60,000 years, whose knowledge of that continent was immeasurably deeper than anything the colonizers brought with them, and whose physical endurance, in some cases, exceeded anything the colonizing population could match. A colonialism that acknowledged all of this would have been a very different colonialism from the one that was practiced. It might even have been a colonialism that asked different questions about its own right to proceed in the way it was proceeding. And so the acknowledgement was not made, and the evidence that would have required it was suppressed, and the project proceeded, and here we are. Here we are in a world made by that project, sorting through the archives of its making, trying to understand what it concealed and why, and asking, with what patience we can muster, what an honest accounting of the past would contain that the current accounting does not. The honest accounting would contain a man of 9 feet, standing in the Queensland interior in 1898, standing willingly for a photograph because he was not afraid and because he had nothing to hide. Because the large scale of his body was simply the reality of what he was, and his community's knowledge of what he was had been carried across centuries to the moment when the European researchers arrived with their cameras and their curiosity and their inability to fully process what they were seeing. It would contain his community's understanding of what his existence meant, the tradition they had preserved about the beings like him, about their relationship to the country, about their role in the long human history of the continent. It would contain the interpreter's knowledge, the knowledge of the Aboriginal men and women who stood between the European researchers and the old man and who understood, in a way the Europeans could not, what was actually happening in that encounter, and what it meant that it was happening. And it would contain the honest acknowledgement that all of this was taken, deliberately and with full awareness of what was being taken, by a government that understood the value of what it was removing and chose to remove it anyway. This is the accounting that has not been made. This is the story that has not been told in any institution that has the resources and the authority to make it official. It has been told in fragments, in the margins, in local histories and private letters and online forums and accounts like this one, by people who do not have institutional authority but who have paid enough attention to the evidence to understand what it is saying. The evidence is patient. It has been waiting for over a century. It does not require vindication or urgency. It is simply there in the archive and in the tradition and in the shaped absences that surround it, waiting for the questions to become serious enough to deserve it. We believe they are becoming serious enough. We believe that the combination of better archival access, better interdisciplinary frameworks, better relationships between the research community and the Aboriginal communities whose traditions are the most important part of the evidence, and better public attention to the questions that official history has not answered, is creating conditions under which genuine inquiry is possible in a way that it has not been before. We cannot promise answers. We can only point toward the direction of the questions. The photograph is gone. The man who stood in it existed. The community that knew who he was still carries the knowledge of what he meant. And the questions that the photograph would have answered have not gone away because the photograph was taken from us. They have simply been waiting with the patience of things that have been carried a very long time for the world to be ready to hear them. Tonight, in this quiet, we have tried to be ready. The story does not end here. It continues in the archive and in the tradition and in the ongoing work of the people who are paying attention to the evidence in the ways that the evidence requires. It continues in the conversations that follow accounts like this one, in the questions that listeners and readers take into their days and their research and their thinking about what the human past actually contains. It continues because it has to continue. The truth of it has not diminished with the passage of time. The man in the photograph was real. His existence was part of the story of the oldest continent on Earth, a story that the colonizers did not write and could not erase, however hard they tried, because it was written in the land itself, in the traditions carried by the people of the land, and in the memory of what had been present on that land before the present era, before the era of suppression and management and careful absence. That memory persists. And in the persistence of that memory, the last Australian giant, who was photographed in 1898 and whose photograph was then seized, continues to stand, continues to be present, continues to be real. He is still there in the tradition that carries him, in the questions that his existence raises, in the shapes of what was taken away around him. And we, tonight, in the quiet of whatever room you are resting in as these words reach you, have spent some hours in his company. That is not nothing. It is, in its way, everything. Good night. The hours after midnight have a quality that the daytime does not have. The world is quieter, the usual noise of things asserting themselves has receded, and in that recession, the things that have been waiting to be heard have more room. The story we have been telling tonight is one of those things. It has been waiting a long time in the rooms and margins of the archive, in the deep storage of traditions that were never meant to be suppressed, but that the people who came to this continent with their cameras and their surveys and their administrative machinery found inconvenient enough to push to the side. We want to spend some more time tonight, in the quiet that surrounds us, with the specific character of this inconvenience and what it tells us about the relationship between power and knowledge in this specific historical moment of colonial Australia. The late 19th century was, globally, a period of enormous intellectual confidence. The Western scientific tradition had achieved, in the preceding decades, a series of breakthroughs that seemed to confirm that the methods of scientific inquiry were capable of producing accurate and comprehensive knowledge about the world. Darwin's work on evolution had provided a framework for understanding the history of life on Earth. Geological survey had produced detailed maps of the physical world. Physics and chemistry were transforming the material world in ways that seemed to confirm the power of scientific rationality to bend reality to human purposes. This intellectual confidence had a shadow side. The confidence that science could know the world accurately also produced a confidence that science could classify the world correctly, that the categories science produced were not merely convenient tools for organizing knowledge, but accurate reflections of the actual structure of reality. And in the domain of human biology and human history, this classificatory confidence produced frameworks that were not merely wrong but actively harmful, that ranked human populations on scales of development and sophistication in ways that served colonial power and that are now understood to have been, from their foundations, scientifically invalid. The dying race theory, which provided the ideological framework for the suppression we have been examining, was one expression of this classificatory confidence. It held that the Aboriginal populations of Australia were on a developmental trajectory that was leading toward extinction, that this trajectory was the result of an inherent incapacity to compete with more advanced civilizations, and that the appropriate scientific response was to document what remained before it disappeared, rather than to question the framework that predicted its disappearance. This theory was held not by bad scientists, but by the leading scientists of the era, by people who believed themselves to be engaged in honest and careful inquiry, and who understood themselves to be serving the interests of knowledge rather than the interests of power. The persistence of this framework, despite mounting evidence that contradicted it, is one of the defining features of the scientific history of this period. The Aboriginal populations did not disappear. The individuals whose existence contradicted the dying race narrative continued to be encountered. The traditions whose depth and accuracy contradicted the primitive superstition characterization continued to demonstrate their reliability. And yet, the framework persisted, because the frameworks that serve power are maintained by more than their intellectual merits. They are maintained by institutional momentum, by career incentives, by the difficulty of acknowledging that one's most fundamental assumptions were wrong, and by the active interest of those who benefit from the framework in ensuring that it continues. The suppression of the 1898 photograph was not an isolated act of institutional defensiveness. It was an expression of a comprehensive commitment to maintaining a framework that the photograph, had it circulated, would have challenged in a specific and undeniable way. The photograph was one piece of evidence, but it was evidence of a kind that the framework had no room to accommodate, and the framework responded to it in the only way available, by ensuring that it could not be seen. Now, let us think about the individuals who conducted this suppression. Because the suppression was conducted by individuals, even if it served institutional ends, and the individuals who conducted it made choices that deserve examination. The official or officials who arranged for the seizure of the 1898 expedition's photographs were not anonymous forces of history. They were people. They had names, they had careers and families and beliefs about what they were doing and why. They believed, in all probability, that they were serving the legitimate interests of the colonial administration, maintaining order and narrative coherence in a situation where disruptive evidence had emerged, doing the kind of administrative work that needed to be done quietly and without fanfare. This is how most suppression works. The people who conduct it do not see themselves as suppressors. They see themselves as administrators, as managers, as people who are handling things appropriately. The framework within which they are operating tells them that the evidence they are suppressing is not really evidence, that the claims it supports are not legitimate scientific claims, that the people whose traditions and whose physical presence the evidence reflects do not constitute a category of knowledge that deserves the respect that would make its suppression feel like suppression. This is the most effective form of suppression, the form in which the suppressors genuinely do not understand themselves as suppressing anything important. They are simply filing things away, directing things to their appropriate locations, ensuring that the institutional record reflects what the institution has determined the record should reflect. The violence of this process is distributed across the ordinary actions of ordinary institutional life, and is therefore invisible to everyone who does not have the perspective of the people whose knowledge and whose lives are being managed. The Aboriginal communities of Queensland in 1898 had that perspective. They knew that what was happening when the expedition arrived, and when the photograph was taken, and when the photographs were then seized, was not a neutral scientific encounter. They knew, in the way that communities know things that are happening to them, even when they cannot articulate those things in the language of the people doing them, that something was being taken that should not have been taken, that the encounter had consequences that the European researchers did not fully understand, and that the colonial administration understood very well. What those communities could not do in 1898 was prevent the taking. They could not appeal to institutions that would hear them. They could not publish accounts that would reach the audiences that mattered. They could not assert the rights that the colonial framework did not acknowledge they had. What they could do, and what they did, was remember. They continued to carry, in the tradition, the knowledge that the photograph was designed to capture, and that the seizure was designed to eliminate. They carried it across the decades that followed, through every disruption and displacement and dispossession that the colonial and post-colonial periods brought, because the knowledge was too important to lose, and because the carrying of it was itself an act of resistance to the management of their history by people who did not have the right to manage it. We want to speak directly for a moment to that act of resistance, because it is the most important thing in this story, and it has not been given enough space in our account. The Aboriginal communities that preserved the knowledge of the large beings, that maintained the traditions across 60,000 years and through 2 centuries of colonial disruption, performed an act of cultural preservation that has no parallel in any other tradition on earth. The span of time across which this knowledge was preserved, the conditions under which it was preserved, and the completeness with which it was preserved all speak to a commitment to the truth of the knowledge that exceeds anything the Western archival tradition has achieved. The Western archival tradition produces institutions, buildings and catalogues and preservation facilities and professional conservators. It produces conditions under which documents can survive for centuries, sometimes for millennia. It is an impressive achievement in material terms, in the terms of what physical infrastructure can do to protect physical objects against physical processes of decay. But the Aboriginal oral tradition preserved knowledge for 60,000 years without institutions, without buildings, without physical infrastructure. It preserved knowledge through the commitment of communities to the act of remembrance, through the understanding that certain things needed to be carried, that the carrying was not a burden but a responsibility, and that the responsibility was one of the defining obligations of membership in the community. This is a more impressive achievement than any archive because it depended not on the durability of physical objects but on the durability of human commitment. The traditions that preserved the knowledge of the large beings were preserved this way, by people who understood that what they were carrying was real and important, who taught their children that it was real and important, and whose children taught their children, and whose children's children taught their children, and so on, through the long succession of generations that separates the living from the distant past. Tonight, in the quiet, we are in the presence of that succession. The knowledge that has been carried all that way has reached us through the accounts of the people who carry it, through the fragments of it that escaped suppression and made it into the archive, through the shaped absences that mark where the suppression operated, and through the traditions that survived because the communities that carried them understood the importance of survival. This is a gift. It is a gift from 60,000 years of careful remembrance to a present that has not always earned it. The appropriate response to this gift is not certainty, not the confident assertion that now we know everything we need to know about what happened. The appropriate response is humility and attention, and the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to conclusions that discomfort the comfortable frameworks we have inherited. Let us follow the evidence a little further before we rest. The question we have not fully addressed tonight is the question of what happened to the population, of which the old man in the 1898 photograph may have been one of the last individuals. Not just the question of the photograph and its suppression, but the deeper question of what happened to cause the population to decline to the point where a single elderly individual in a remote community was notable enough to prompt an expedition, was described as the last of something, was regarded, even by the Aboriginal community that knew him, as the end of a lineage. The Aboriginal traditions do not speak in general of a catastrophic extinction event. They speak of a gradual withdrawal of beings that became fewer and more remote, that retreated into the deeper interior as the human landscape around them changed. This is consistent with the pattern of any population under ecological pressure: a contraction toward the last viable refugia, a decrease in range, an increase in the remoteness of the remaining individuals, and eventually the end. What created the ecological pressure? This is a question that the tradition does not directly answer, at least not in the portions of the tradition that have been accessible to outside researchers. But the timing of the decline, as suggested by the traditions, appears to be connected to the broader disruptions of the late prehistoric period in Australia, the period of climatic change and ecological transformation that preceded European contact by thousands of years in some regions and by centuries in others. Australia's climate has changed significantly over the past 20,000 years, since the last glacial maximum, and those changes have transformed the ecology of the continent in ways that would have had profound effects on human populations adapted to specific ecological conditions. The large interior lakes that existed during the wetter periods of the late Pleistocene have dried to salt pans. The river systems that were more extensive in wetter periods have contracted. The food resources available in the interior have become more variable and more sparse than they were in the era of greater rainfall. A large-bodied human population with high caloric needs would have been disproportionately affected by these changes. The contraction of the continent's most productive ecological zones, the river systems and the permanent water sources, would have created pressure on exactly the kind of population that the traditions describe, concentrated in the productive interior, dependent on the food resources that the river country provided. As those resources became less reliable, the population would have contracted, and the contraction would have followed the ecological gradient, withdrawing toward the most persistent and productive refugia. By the time of European contact, the population may have been reduced to a very small number of individuals in the most remote and most persistently productive parts of the interior. The traditions of various Aboriginal nations preserve this reduced population as something known but not commonly encountered, something that had been more present in earlier generations, something that was becoming rarer, and the European accounts from the early contact period, which describe occasional encounters with individuals of extraordinary size but do not describe these as routine or expected, are consistent with a very small population in isolated locations. By 1898, the old man photographed in Queensland may have been, as he was described, genuinely the last of a population that had been present on the Australian continent for tens of thousands of years, whose existence had been shaped by the ecology of the interior in ways that produced dimensions and capabilities outside the range of ordinary human populations, and whose final representative died in a remote community in Queensland, while the photograph that documented his existence was being carried away by agents of a government that had decided he should not exist in the record. This is a melancholy end to a long story, but it is not, perhaps, the actual end, because the tradition that carried the knowledge of him and his like is still carried, and the people who carry it are still here. And the knowledge they carry, the knowledge of what was present on this continent before the current era, is still available to those who approach it with the respect and the seriousness that it deserves. The photograph was taken in 1898. The photographs were seized. The man who stood in them was real. His community was real. His tradition was real. And we, in the quiet of tonight, have spent some hours in the presence of all of that reality. That is something. In the accounting of this long suppression, it is perhaps something small, but it is real, and it is a step, and the steps accumulate. And the direction they are accumulating toward is the direction of a history that tells the truth about what happened on the oldest continent on Earth, to the oldest continuous human tradition on the planet, in the hands of people who arrived from elsewhere and found, in what they saw, only what they needed to see. What they could not see or would not see was the depth of what was already there, the age of it, the scale of it, the extraordinary and irreplaceable humanity of it. The photograph would have shown some of that depth. The man in it, standing at 9 feet in the Queensland interior, would have made visible some of that scale. The tradition that the photograph was part of, the 60,000 years of knowledge that contextualized his existence, would have spoken to some of that irreplaceable humanity. All of that remains in the tradition, in the shaped absences of the archive, in the slow accumulation of questions that have been building for a century and more. We carry it with us as we settle towards sleep. We will be here, and the questions will be here when you return. There is something we should say about the shape of time in Australia, because the shape of time in Australia is different from the shape of time in most of the places from which the ideas about Australian history have historically been imported. In Europe, history has a specific beginning point. The written record begins somewhere, and before that beginning is prehistory, which means, in the European framework, a time before history, a time about which we know only what the physical record tells us, a time that lacks the voices and the perspectives that the written record provides. This framework treats the beginning of writing as the beginning of historical consciousness, as the moment at which human beings became capable of recording their experience in a form that other human beings could access across time and distance. Australia breaks this framework completely. The Aboriginal tradition of Australia has been preserving and transmitting knowledge for 60,000 years without writing. The knowledge it has preserved is not lesser knowledge for having been preserved in this way. It is knowledge of extraordinary depth and precision. Knowledge that includes, as we have noted, accurate information about geological events, sea level changes, and astronomical phenomena. Knowledge that is proven, when tested against the physical record, to be reliable in ways that the European historical tradition, at its most careful, has sometimes failed to match. The shape of time in this tradition is not linear in the way that European time is linear. It is not a sequence of events proceeding from a beginning toward an end. It is more accurately described as a depth, a layering, in which the deep past and the recent past and the present are all simultaneously accessible in the tradition, in which the knowledge of what happened 60,000 years ago is not less present or less vivid than the knowledge of what happened a century ago, because the tradition has been designed, across its entire span of development, to make knowledge accessible rather than to allow it to recede into an inaccessible past. This is relevant to the question of the large beings, because the temporal location of these beings in the Aboriginal traditions is not a remote mythological past. It is a past that feels recent in the tradition's own terms, a past that is located in the temporal zone that the tradition describes as having been known by remembered generations, not by the founding figures of the dreaming, but by the ancestors of people alive in the historical period. This temporal location is consistent with what we have proposed about the actual timeline of the population's decline. A decline that was ongoing in the last few thousand years, that left the population reduced to isolated individuals in the most remote regions by the period of European contact, and that produced, by 1898, the specific situation of an elderly last representative whose existence was documented and then suppressed. The tradition's temporal location of these beings, in the recent historical past rather than in the mythological deep time, is evidence that the tradition is encoding a real historical memory rather than an elaborated mythological figure. Mythological figures are typically located in the founding time, in the dreaming that precedes the historical present. The large beings of the tradition are located in a different time zone, a time that the tradition's own structure identifies as historical rather than mythological. This distinction is not widely appreciated outside of the specialist literature on Aboriginal oral tradition, and it deserves more attention in discussions of this material than it typically receives. The temporal structure of the tradition is one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for understanding what the tradition is actually encoding, and the temporal location of the large being accounts in the recent historical past is a strong indicator that these accounts encode real historical memories rather than elaborated myths. The Trove Archive, which we mentioned earlier in the context of the newspaper record, deserves some additional attention here because it represents a genuinely new opportunity for research into questions like the one we have been examining tonight. Trove is the National Library of Australia's digital repository for historical Australian materials. It includes digitised versions of historical newspapers, government documents, academic publications, and a variety of other materials, and it is searchable in ways that the physical archive is not. The digitisation of historical Australian newspapers through Trove has made it possible to search across hundreds of newspapers and decades of publication for specific terms and topics in ways that would have required years of manual archive work before digitisation. This represents a genuine transformation in the accessibility of historical evidence, and it is a transformation that has barely begun to be applied to questions like the one we have been examining. The searches that would be required to comprehensively map the newspaper evidence for large Aboriginal individuals and for unusual skeletal finds in the colonial period, searches that would have been practically impossible before digitisation, are now feasible, though still time-consuming, and requiring judgment in the interpretation of results. Researchers who have conducted partial searches along these lines have found, as we noted earlier, a substantial body of relevant material. A comprehensive search, conducted with the rigour that the question deserves, would almost certainly produce a significantly larger and more clearly organised body of evidence than any researcher has yet assembled. This is work that needs to be done. It is work that the tools now available make possible in a way they were not even 20 years ago. And the picture that such a comprehensive search would produce would be, based on what the partial searches have already found, a picture of a pattern of reporting across decades and regions that is far more extensive and more consistent than the official history of the question would suggest. We mention this here not because the work has been done, but because it needs to be done, and because the people who hear accounts like this one are sometimes the people who go on to do the work that needs to be done. The questions we have been raising tonight are not questions that can only be pursued by people with institutional affiliations and research budgets. They are questions that can be pursued by anyone with the patience to work through the Trove Archive, the curiosity to follow the documentary threads wherever they lead, and the seriousness to apply rigorous standards of evidence to what they find. The democratization of historical research, made possible by digitization projects like Trove, is one of the most significant developments of our time for questions that official history has declined to ask. The gatekeeping function of institutional peer review, which has consistently operated to exclude questions about large Aboriginal individuals from legitimate academic discourse, has much less power over research conducted outside institutional frameworks, research conducted by people who are asking the questions because the questions matter rather than because the questions fit within the categories that institutions have defined as acceptable. This does not mean that all amateur research is good research. It means that the distinction between institutional and amateur research is less reliable as a guide to quality than it might appear, and that questions excluded from institutional research on grounds of acceptability rather than on grounds of evidentiary poverty deserve to be pursued by whoever has the patience and the rigour to pursue them well. The question of the last Australian giant, photographed in 1898 and suppressed in the weeks that followed, is one of those questions. It has been excluded from institutional research, not because the evidence is thin, but because the framework that defines legitimate questions has not had room for it. That framework is changing. The evidence has not changed. The patience of the questions has not diminished. There is one more thing to be said tonight about the specific quality of loss that attends this story. The quality of a loss that is not merely evidentiary, but personal and communal. The old man in the photograph had a name. He had a history. He had a place within the community that knew him, a role, a set of relationships, a way of being understood by the people who had known him all his life. He had a past that extended back through the tradition his community carried, a past that connected his existence to the thousands of years of human presence on the continent that preceded him. All of that was his. It was not the colonial administration's to take. It was not the scientific frameworks to dismiss. It was not the institutional archives to lose through its various processes of managed neglect. It was his and his community's and the traditions. The photograph was only the surface of what was taken. What was really taken was the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that he existed in the way that he existed, that his existence was real and significant and worth preserving in the record of his country's history, that the tradition of which he was a part was a tradition that encoded real knowledge about real things and deserved the respect that real knowledge deserves. That acknowledgement has not been made by any institution with the authority to make it binding. It has been made in fragments by researchers and writers and community members who understood what they were dealing with and said so to the audiences available to them. It has been made tonight in this quiet space by us to you. It is not enough, but it is something, and it points in the direction of the something more that needs to be made by institutions with the authority to make it binding, in language that the official record will preserve rather than lose. We are not there yet, but we are, perhaps, moving in that direction. The questions are more widely asked than they have been. The evidence is more accessible than it has been. The relationship between official history and the communities it has suppressed is more contested and more honestly examined than it has been. The conditions are better than they have been for the inquiry that this question deserves. We hold that as we settle toward the end of tonight's account with the kind of careful hope that is not optimism but is not despair. The hope of people who have looked at the evidence and understood that it points toward a truth that has not yet been fully told, but that the world is slowly becoming capable of hearing. The photograph of 1898 was taken. It showed something real. It was then taken away. The taking away was a wrong. The wrong has not been righted, but the knowledge of the wrong exists, and the evidence of it persists, and the tradition of which the old man was a part continues to be carried. That is where we leave it. Not in resolution, because resolution has not yet arrived. In the honest acknowledgement that the questions remain, that the evidence is real, that the people who preserved the tradition across 60,000 years deserve the acknowledgement that the official history has withheld, and that the work of providing that acknowledgement is the work of our time. Tonight, we did some of that work. Tomorrow it continues. Sleep well. The questions will be patient, as they have always been patient. And so will we. We want to offer something else before we are finished, something that sits outside the structure of the list in the argument, something that belongs to the quieter register of what it means to carry a story like this one for any length of time. The people who have spent their lives paying attention to this material, the researchers whose papers became difficult to find, the anthropologists whose monographs were rejected, the geologists whose field observations were reclassified by institutional fiat, the settler families who kept the accounts their grandparents had given them, the Aboriginal knowledge holders who continued to carry the traditions through every pressure applied to make them stop, all of these people have known something that is difficult to know, that the truth of what you are saying is clear to you, and that the institutions with the authority to validate it have decided not to. This is a specific form of difficulty that has no comfortable resolution. You cannot simply produce more evidence because the frameworks that determine what counts as evidence have excluded the category of thing you're trying to evidence. You cannot simply make a better argument because the spaces in which arguments of this type would be heard and seriously evaluated are not available to you. You are left with the truth of what you know and the absence of the institutional acknowledgement that would make that truth part of the official record. This is a condition that has been experienced across the history of inquiry by people who were later vindicated. It is also a condition experienced by people who were not vindicated, whose claims proved on examination to be the product of wishful thinking or misidentified evidence or the simple human desire to find in the world something more strange and wonderful than the official record contains. The experience of carrying knowledge that institutions decline to validate does not by itself tell you which of these you are. What tells you, as well as anything can, is the quality of the evidence and the honesty of your relationship to it. The evidence for large Aboriginal individuals in Australia is, as we have tried to show tonight, substantial, consistent, and multiply-sourced. It comes from Aboriginal oral tradition, from European eyewitness accounts, from newspaper reports, from museum inventories, from the shaped absences in colonial archives, and from the accounts of settler families with no stake in the question beyond the stake created by having witnessed or heard about specific things. These sources do not coordinate with each other. They approach the question from different directions and with different frameworks, and they converge with the variation that real independent observation produces on a consistent account of something real. This is not wishful thinking. Wishful thinking does not produce this kind of consistency from this many independent sources over this long a period of time. Wishful thinking produces accounts that all look alike, that share the same dramatic details, that can be traced to a common source. The evidence for large Aboriginal individuals in Australia does not look like that. It looks like what it is, which is the record of a real phenomenon encountered by many different people in many different contexts, documented imperfectly and in fragments, suppressed when the documentation became threatening to institutional interests, and preserved where the suppression did not reach. Holding that with honesty means holding it without forcing it to a conclusion that the evidence does not fully support. It means saying this happened, or something very like this happened, and the evidence for it is real, and the suppression of it was real, and the tradition that preserved it is real. And it means being willing to stop there, to hold the open question without forcing the answer, because the honest acknowledgement of what we know and what we do not know is more respectful of the evidence and more respectful of the people whose tradition and whose history the evidence belongs to, than any confident claim that exceeds what the evidence can carry. The old man stood in the photograph. The photograph was seized. We do not know exactly what happened after that. We do not know who made the specific decisions or where the plates ended up or whether any copy survived in any form. We do not know the old man's name or the name of his community or the full content of what the interpreters understood about who he was and what his existence meant. These are real gaps. We have tried to be honest about them throughout this account, even as we have also tried to show that the gaps do not eliminate the significance of what we do know. What we know is enough to make the question serious. It is enough to establish that something important happened and was then suppressed. It is enough to point in the direction that further inquiry should go. And it is enough, perhaps, to allow the account we have given tonight to serve as a small contribution to the recognition that the last Australian giant, photographed in 1898, was a real person in a real community with a real tradition behind him, and that his existence and the existence of those who came before him in that tradition deserves acknowledgement in the history of the oldest continent on Earth. The Southern Cross is visible from Australia on most clear nights. It has been visible from Australia for all 60,000 years, and more of human presence on the continent, and the Aboriginal traditions of Australia have incorporated it into their understanding of the sky and the seasons and the deep time of the world. The people who carried the knowledge of the large beings across all those years looked up at the same stars and understood themselves and their knowledge in relation to those stars in ways that the European tradition has only recently begun to take seriously as a form of genuine astronomical knowledge. There is something fitting in a way that resists complete articulation about the fact that the oldest human tradition on Earth and the beings it remembers as part of the human landscape of the continent exist under those stars. The stars do not change on the timescale of human history. They were there when the first humans arrived on the continent 65,000 years ago. They were there when the large beings of the tradition were present in the river country of the interior. They were there in 1898 when the photograph was taken in Queensland, and they are there now, above the continent, above the archive and the tradition, and the shaped absences and the questions that persist. The questions persist under those stars, the tradition persists under those stars. The acknowledgement that needs to be made persists as a need under those stars. And we, in the quiet of this account, have spent some hours under them, together with the story that has been waiting for the attention it deserves. The last Australian giant was photographed in 1898. The photographs were seized, the man who stood in them was real, and the truth of his existence has been waiting, patient as the stars, for the world to be ready to hear it. We are trying, tonight and in the nights that come after, to be ready. Good night, rest well. The questions and the stars will be there when you wake. There is one more quality of this material that we have not yet named directly, and naming it feels important before we truly rest. The people who preserved the knowledge we have been discussing tonight did not do so in the abstract. They did not preserve it as an intellectual exercise or as a contribution to a scholarly debate that they were not part of. They preserved it because it was theirs, because it belonged to their community, because the beings it described were part of the human story of the land they had always lived on, and because the obligation to carry that story forward was not optional, was not something they could set down when it became burdensome, was instead one of the defining responsibilities of being the kind of people they were in the kind of place they were. This is worth sitting with for a moment, in the quiet. The responsibility to carry knowledge forward, to hold it in trust for those who come after, is not a responsibility that the modern world asks of many people in the explicit and communal way that Aboriginal Australian tradition asks it. In the modern world, knowledge is stored in institutions. Libraries and databases and server farms hold what previous generations knew, and individuals can access that stored knowledge when they need it without being the carriers of it themselves. This is efficient. It is also, in ways that we have seen tonight, fragile. The institutions that store the knowledge make decisions about what to store and what to let go, and those decisions are not always, and not even usually, made in the interest of comprehensive truth. They are made in the interest of the institution, which is always in the end the interest of the people who control the institution. The oral tradition does not work this way. The knowledge stored in an oral tradition is not held by an institution. It is held by people, by communities, by the living relationships between knowledge holders and the people they teach. When an institution decides to suppress a piece of knowledge, it can remove it from the institutional record relatively cleanly. When a community decides that a piece of knowledge must be carried, the suppression of that knowledge requires the suppression of the people who carry it, which is a much more difficult and much more obviously violent act. This is why the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australia survived 2 centuries of colonial pressure, while the institutional records produced during those 2 centuries are full of managed absences and shaped suppressions. The colonial administration could suppress the photograph. It could not suppress the tradition. The photograph was in its power, the tradition was not. And so the photograph is gone and the tradition continues. And the tradition continues to know, among many other things, that beings of extraordinary size were part of the human landscape of this continent, and that the knowledge of their existence deserves to be carried and transmitted and eventually acknowledged. We are part of that acknowledgement tonight. Small and imperfect and distant from the sources of the tradition, but genuinely part of it nonetheless. Because the acknowledgement that matters is not only the institutional acknowledgement, the acknowledgement by bodies with the formal authority to revise the official record. The acknowledgement that matters is also the acknowledgement of people paying attention, of people taking seriously what has been told to them, of people treating the evidence with the respect that it deserves, and the tradition with the dignity that it has earned through 60,000 years of faithful carrying. That is what we have tried to do tonight. The old man stood in the photograph. The community that knew him carried his story. The tradition that contextualized his existence had been carrying the stories of those like him for as long as human beings had been present on the continent. The photograph was seized. The tradition was not. And so, in the end, the tradition wins. Not quickly, not without cost, not without the loss of the specific record that the photograph would have provided, but in the longer arc, in the arc that runs across the full span of human presence on the oldest continent on Earth, the tradition wins, because the tradition has always understood that the arc is long and has always been willing to carry the knowledge across it, one generation at a time, one careful transmission at a time, until the time is right for it to be heard. Tonight is one of those times. The time is not yet fully right, because the acknowledgement is not yet institutional, and the inquiry is not yet what it needs to be. But it is more right than it was, and it will be more right again as the evidence is followed, and the questions are asked, and the tradition is engaged with the seriousness it has always deserved. The last Australian giant was photographed in 1898. The photographs were seized, but the story was not. And here we are. The archive is not only made of paper and photographs and the silence between the catalogue entries. The archive is also made of people the people who carried knowledge when there was no paper to put it on, no institution to hold it for them, no framework that acknowledged the legitimacy of what they knew. The archive of a 60,000-year tradition is the people of that tradition, and the people of that tradition are still here, on the continent that their ancestors have known since before any other human tradition was in the world. They have been waiting, with the patience that long inhabitation of a place produces, for the questions to become serious enough to meet them where they are. Some researchers have made that journey, others are making it. The journey requires leaving behind the assumptions of a tradition that has treated Aboriginal knowledge as something to be explained rather than something to learn from, and arriving with genuine humility at the recognition that 60,000 years of faithful knowledge preservation represents something that the Western tradition, in all its institutional sophistication, has not yet replicated and may not be capable of replicating. The knowledge that tradition preserves includes the memory of the beings we have been discussing tonight, includes the detailed and consistent accounts of their physical characteristics, their ecological associations, their places in the human landscape of the continent, and their decline. Includes the specific and differentiated vocabulary that multiple languages developed to describe them. Includes the geographic knowledge of where they were found, which maps, with enough precision to be geographically meaningful, onto the river country, and the elevated interior that the ecological analysis would independently suggest as their most likely habitat. All of this knowledge is waiting. It has been waiting through 2 centuries of suppression and dismissal and the aggressive management of the official record. It will continue waiting with the characteristic patience of things that have been carried a very long time, until the inquiry it deserves is conducted by people with the skills and the access and the relationships with the relevant communities to do it properly. We hope that the people conducting that inquiry are alive today. We hope that the tools and the archives and the interdisciplinary frameworks that would allow it to be done are being developed or are already available. We hope that the relationship between the research community and the Aboriginal communities whose knowledge is the heart of the inquiry is becoming the relationship of genuine collaboration and mutual respect that it needs to be for the inquiry to produce what it is capable of producing. We hold these hopes in the quiet of this account without forcing them to become predictions or promises. Hopes are not predictions, they are orientations, ways of facing the future that acknowledge what is possible without claiming to know what will happen. The possibility of genuine inquiry into the question we have been examining tonight is real. Whether that possibility will be realized and when and by whom is not ours to know. What is ours to know is that the question is real, that the evidence is real, that the tradition that preserved the knowledge through 60,000 years of faithful carrying is real, and that the last Australian giant, standing in the Queensland interior in 1898, looking into a camera that would produce an image that would then be taken from him and from his people, was as real as anyone who has ever stood on the oldest continent on Earth. He was real. His people were real. Their knowledge was real. And the story of what happened to the evidence of his existence, and what did not happen, and what might yet happen, is a story that the oldest human tradition on the planet has been waiting to see told. We have tried tonight to tell some of it. The rest is for the inquiry that is coming. Sleep well. The tradition is patient, and so now are we.